eastern Wyoming, I had a clarifying moment that really solidified a lot of the vague feelings I had been having traveling through the American West. It happened, naturally, because my dogs had to take a shit. It was early, around 10 in the morning, and I had been driving westward out of Thunder Basin National Grassland for a few hours already, the sky getting blacker and meaner and windier the further down the road I went. Eventually, the dogs got to barking, so I pulled off on a dirt road to walk them. There were a lot of semi-trucks around on account of the mines, but I'd hardly seen a house since Wright, miles back, and Wright isn't much more than 2 gas stations and modest, weather-beaten homes for the miners. Miles outside town, on this dirt road I was walking the dogs along, was this lonely little building with boarded-up windows. The sign out front said it was a community center, proudly restored in 1976, and then, it seems, completely ignored for 41 years. The inside was rotted out and covered in graffiti, with dark stairs going down and the wind whistling through the torn-up windows. There was a hymnal on the ground, and flipping it open randomly, I happened upon a hymn called The Beautiful Valley of Eden. It was an almost perfect snapshot of rural ruin. Too perfect. A level designer for a game could not have made a more thematically compact microcosm of melancholy decay. Hell, Andrew Wyeth couldn't have done much better himself. In games, this trope of the gone-away world is common because it gives a baseline of civilization and technology while dialing back the civilized element to the point where a Wild West re-emerges, a toothy and violent second frontier growing like weeds out of the cracks in abandoned driveways and freeways. But this place is not art, although it is beautiful. This is a real shack out here on the prairie, and once, some indeterminate period of time ago, it brought people together to pray and find solace in each other while outside the wind howled and the world turned. It kept turning, and now all that's left here is spiders, the occasional drunk teenager with a can of spray paint, and, rarely, a traveler with a lack of respect for fences. Eventually, the winds and the snow will grind it down into a small mound of dirt and buried nails. Out here, things don't seem to get torn down, they seem to fall down. Even within towns, people live right next door to decay. In small town after small town, there's always a business with a collapsed roof or an old farmhouse toppled in on itself, growing moss and vines while life goes on around it. For now. I've been used to the coast, where there's enough people and enough money to keep everything in flux. I mean, sure, there's rot there too, a drive through modern Aberdeen is enough to tell you that, but it is 2017 out there. It's modernity. Here in Wyoming, the present is less certain. Time's kept moving, but the land and its people are stranded in the rhythms of long and quiet lives in a vast and quiet place. The world inside my phone is vastly different from the one just a year ago. The world pouring in through the broken-out windows of this community center is little different than the one 100 years back, even 200 years back. Take out the roads and throw in some bison, and you really could be talking in the thousands of years. Post-nuclear, as the apocalypse a video game would lead me to expect would leave behind something like this. That's tidy, it's dramatic, and it gives an excuse for why everyone might leave their stuff behind for you to root through. But this actual place is what it looks like to leave a world behind. Empty. Barren, picked clean, restored, and immediately left fallow again. The American West is a place that has shaped the character of the nation and the tone of so much of our art, but it's bigger and deeper and more patient than we can functionally comprehend, and it is fast outliving our characterization of it as the frontier we tamed because we were, supposedly, some kind of great people. It's out here you can see the clearest what happens when the tide of time and decay rises up not only to tear down the sandcastles, but the real castles perched on the cliffs above. It's here you can see that many people have tried to win the West, but that none have actually succeeded. Not even us. As the land was once mysterious because it was unknown, it is mysterious again because we have forgotten so much of it. Hollywood had prepared me for the first half of the West, but it did nothing at all to ready me for the other half. The VW bus I was exploring around in is built without a radiator, so my wife, our dog, and I had settled for the summer in Gunnison, Colorado after the southwestern leg of the trip I wrote up in the Desert Bus video, so that the heat didn't crush the life out of the bus and out of our enthusiasm for travel. Gunnison was meant, once, to be the state capital, and so urban designers made the streets double wide to accommodate its eventual growth into a city. This never happened, so what you've got is a small town sitting comfortably in the frame of a much larger one, unassuming houses sitting distantly from each other across over-designed boulevards. I don't think I've ever lived anywhere with so much free parking in my life. Kendra and I swam in the reservoir, we bought a puppy, we drank cheap cocktails, and got Philly cheesesteaks at a gas station called the Power Stop. The weeks passed quickly in the green of the mountains and the relaxed pace of life in the town. In August, the heat began to ebb away down into the 80s, and it was time to move on again, though. And as it happened, Gunnison is smack dab in the middle of some of Colorado's most remarkable and least visited landscape. Right nearby was a national park I had never heard of before, Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. Now, the Grand Canyon is world famous. Arizona's license plates declare it to be the Grand Canyon State, and it is, no question, grand as hell. Yet it seems there's only room in America's heart for one canyon, because Black Canyon of the Gunnison is nearly as impressive while being twice as unnerving. I've never in my life seen a landscape that made me feel anxious and uneasy, not until the Black Canyon. It's deep, about half as deep as the Grand Canyon, but what seems like only a tenth as wide. You can't even see it from the surrounding area. For the many miles it takes to get to it from the main roads, most of those miles still unpaved, all you see is rolling foothills of the western slope in the foreground and the distant tops of the alpine peaks further up to the east, the sky open and bright as it slopes downward and downward towards the west. One set of hills goes up, comes down, and you get ready to go up the next set of hills, but you can't, all of a sudden, because there's an abyssal crack in the earth going straight down into murky shadow blocking the path. The somber gray rock itself is even unnervingly old, 1.7 billion years in most places along the wall. Where there are a lot of shrubs along the rim of the road, you can't even see the canyon when you're 100 feet from the rim. It's so narrow, so impossibly and uncomfortably sharp and narrow, that it waits until you're in danger of falling in before even revealing itself to you. I guess calling Colorado the "we've got a weirder, scarier canyon state" doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it is remarkable that this place is so obscure. I've never met anyone who's been there who didn't already live in Gunnison. I have never heard stories of someone's family vacation to Colorado's hellish wound in the earth. But I had never heard of Great Sand Dunes National Park just on the other side of the mountains to the east until I went there earlier in the year either. The Rocky Mountains, sure, they're known all over the world, and for good reason. But how does something so absolutely bizarre and incredible as this sort of landscape get away with relative anonymity in the social media age? Shouldn't there be an endless stream of old folks in 30-foot RVs and young folks in Subarus with selfie sticks here, like every other national park? But no. Out here, there's little but the wind, the abyssal depths of the canyon, and a thin dirt road to show it all off. I suppose there's so many wonders out here that it's only natural that folks would forget one or two along the way. They do say the abyss stares back sometimes, though, and there's at least one very famous local instance of that being so. About 100 miles to the south is Lake City, a place that really is a beautiful Valley of Eden when it isn't covered in snow being driven by 50-mile-an-hour winds. During the summer, it's about the most inviting place I've ever seen in my life. During the winter, it happens to be where, in 1874, Alfred Packer killed 5 of his traveling companions and ate them while lost in the vast and snowy forests up here around 9,000 feet. Alfred Packer kept changing his story when he got back to civilization, from everyone got lost, to they all died but no cannibalism, to maybe a little cannibalism, but we all did it, to finally fleeing to Wyoming for 9 years, where he was eventually arrested in Cheyenne living under a false name, and then hung by the neck until dead. The man looked so ridiculous in photographs, with his roving stare and wild beard. His crime was so outlandish, and his shifting excuse so darkly comical, that Al Packer became an instant folk legend. You can still visit the massacre site a few miles outside town, where it sits incongruously between the driveways of 2 seasonal vacation homes. Today, Colorado winter is hard, but the network of civilization is there. If you order a space heater on Amazon, they'll get it to you out here. Back then, you could kill 5 people and eat them, and maybe even get away with it if you're not a preposterously bad liar like Packer was. There's even an antique meme that came out of his trial. The judge never actually said it, but the local paper embellished Packer's sentencing to include a line that's so deliciously frontiersy there was no way it could have been real to begin with. The line goes, "Stand up, you voracious man-eating son of a bitch. There were only 7 Democrats here in Hinsdale County, but you, damn you, you ate 5 of them." It's an instant classic, even if it is a fake. But so goes the folk legend of Alfred Packer, the weirdo with the beardo, who once actually did murder 5 people, crush their skulls in with a rock, and fucking 8 pieces off of them, in a meadow now occupied by an ordinary-looking housing tract. I'm from California originally, and as a culture we generally like to pretend we don't have any such a thing as history, and in some ways that is true. California has erupted as far as pace of settlement and extent of development goes. When someone puts up a building, that's the first thing that's ever been erected there in a lot of cases, and even if it's not strictly true, the memory of what was there before is always short. One thing the New World of America offered that I think was appealing to European immigrants especially was an escape from having to live on the blood-soaked battlefields of years past. Of course, that promise was immediately betrayed by the wave of violence and genocide that the Europeans inflicted on the indigenous cultures, but that sentiment never went away. It stayed persistent in the developing national spirit. American culture is somewhat defined by its refusal to look backwards, by its feeling that each day is a new day and should be judged as such. Europeans have lived on the bones of their ancestors for many thousands of years and many dozens of generations. It's in the art and the culture, from Memento Mori to the Gothic novel. To me, as a Californian, I find the juxtaposition of Packer's massacre site with the two cheerful houses next to it kind of silly and uncomfortable, but that's a naive way to see it. The frontier spirit says the wild land is yours to tame, that history is written through action in the present, but America is getting older, and it's getting harder to ignore that we've built our suburbs over old bones and dried blood, and that these old misdeeds are always buried just under the foundation. If you live in any city of the old world, from Berlin to Istanbul, you can't escape from that understanding of history. But out here, the vastness of the space tends to swallow the memory of past violence. There are thousands of years of native history we can't even include in the big picture because we killed everyone who could articulate those stories. That's across the entire expanse of the U.S. Not one state is without some past history of cruelty and exploitation in the name of the divine right of manifest destiny. Even between those Europeans who were so insistent that starting fresh was important. The east coast of the U.S. has its share of Walmarts and apartment complexes built over the killing fields of the Civil War, or the Revolutionary War, or the War of 1812, or some unnamed skirmish between angry drunks of the distant past. It sometimes feels, as a 21st century American and a millennial, that being American is like settling down in a haunted house. The paint is fresh, the view is lovely, the realtor assures you that everything is fine, but there are deep stains and secrets and noises in the night every time you drift off into the perception that you're safe and comfortable. Every city is built on bones. But why is it such a surprise to a California boy like me just how far up the bone pile I'm actually sitting? There's a letter from 1823 that I read in Christopher Woodward's amazing exploration of the beauty of decay called In Ruins. This letter describes an American seeing Roman ruins for the first time and comparing them to American cities. This long-gone tourist wrote, quote, "How unlike a scene such as this to the first view of one of our American cities. Instead of the cheerful and exhilarating sight of a savage wilderness retreating before the progress of a free and enlightened society, here we have the poor remains of that mighty city, the cradle and grave of an empire so long triumphant on earth, now dwindling away before the widespread devastation which surrounds it, shrinking back on itself as if for dread of an invisible destroyer." End quote. It's coming up on 200 years since that letter was written, and I don't think the culture at large has reckoned with the idea that we are all also sitting, as the letter put it, in both the cradle and grave of our own country. I spoke earlier about how the world in my phone goes at a different speed than the world I wake up in, but the even greater disconnect is that in the real world, we're surrounded by all the wreckage of time gone by, and online, that old American promise of never having to discuss yesterday still pans out. It's easy to forget how old and huge the country is when it's broken down into high-minded editorials and bite-sized Facebook posts and passive-aggressive pictures with some caption written on it in the impact font. But the physical reality of the country is hard to wrap your head around even when you've been out in it for a while. If you thought abstractly, like such and such a state has these features, the one next to it is different, you're missing the part where different landscapes bleed over into each other and interweave in unexpected patterns. For example, my wife Kendra and I had camped along the Rio Grande River twice back in Texas. Once as the frothing and heavy waters went into the Santa Elena Canyon on the Mexican border in Big Bend National Park, and then again in the town of Rio Grande. But the headwaters of the river, the humble but steady beginning of this river which flows for well over 1,000 miles, is less than 36 miles as the crow flies from Al Packer's massacre site here in Colorado. It begins here, along the western slope, and it is sparkling clean water before the many miles weigh it down with sediment and cow shit. It's not well known or well marked either. You've got to go 30 miles down a dirt road to get to the reservoir. But the road goes along the side of the mountain and 100 feet above the reservoir itself, where the river meets at a small dam. The road is dirt, there's no guardrail, but the view is incredible. There are hardly two places on Earth more different from each other than Lake City, Colorado and Rio Grande, Texas, but the ever-flowing thread of this river connects them. It's a famous river, and one that quite literally defined the shape of the United States on the map. But outside of the place where it's known for being, outside of Texas, Who besides naturalists and cartographers cares where it goes, where it comes from, how many different lands and landscapes it stitches together? The iconography of the American West is one of snapshot moments and individual vistas. The rest is always still out there, abiding, but it's not part of the aesthetic and vibe to zoom out far enough and wait patiently enough to see that nature had already woven the continent together with its own processes and wonders long before we laid our freeways on top of it and called it tamed. That nature will continue to do so long after we've torn it all down and left our toys to rust. If you keep going west from the headwaters of the Rio Grande, it won't be too long before you reach a place where the artificiality of how we see the country, as lines on a map, comes into laser focus. The Four Corners Monument is where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all touch along right angles, meeting up in the middle of a windswept and hot high-desert mesa. You can do the twister thing and use your arms and legs to put yourself in all four states at once. Most people do. It's a hilarious picture. But it's a hilarious absurdity, too, when you get right down to it. You look north, it's desert. South, it's desert. East, more desert. West, still desert. The Navajo operate the monument, and stalls sell goods from local artists alongside more standard knickknacks to the tourists who come through. It's a peculiar thing. The monument commemorates the division of the land by European methods, taking an unbroken and ancient singular landscape and insisting, no, it's actually going to be 4 different places now. A cartographer is probably the least offensive piece of a conquering army, but in terms of shattering the way things used to be perceived before the westward expansion, the cartographer did as much damage and left just as deep a mark as the cavalry did. Chains are how they did it, too. A 66-foot chain that they laid out in a straight line, marking with their instruments that the borders were running along the latitudes and longitudes as decreed by the lawmakers thousands of miles away in Washington. The old lawmakers said, this is where Colorado goes, this is going to be New Mexico, Arizona beyond, and Deseret or Utah or whatever above that, and so sent surveyors to go forth and make it true. The funny thing is that in the modern age of GPS, we now know that the chain-defined boundaries weren't 100% on the money, but courts have upheld the boundaries as they were originally surveyed because that's how we've functionally defined these states for so long now, and damn the math. So, the people who knew the land, back when it was just one place and not 4 places, have opened a bazaar for the passing groups of sunsetter couples in their palatial RVs, and motorcyclists airing their beards out in the dry breeze, and the dogs and hippies who still tumble out of the occasional VW bus. You can get flatbread, household decor, and a constellation of rings and necklaces. Most dolls even accept plastic, running the kiosks off of iPads with little card readers attached like everyone else does nowadays. You can have any kind of souvenir you like for visiting the place where the landscape lost its battle with the abstract. Four Corners fits in comfortably with the genre of roadside oddities and one-offs like The Thing or The Biggest Ball of Twine in Minnesota, but it's got a lot more historical importance than the average roadside oddity. Existentially speaking, this is where you'd come for a front row seat of the idea that America is something we collectively made up and agreed to run with as opposed to some permanent truth of the universe. That permanent truth is out here, in the hot wind as it whips the dust of toppled mountains across your face. But if you're looking for America, you have to line it up with your compass and start dragging your chain out straight. To get a sense of one of the many gone-away worlds we're living in a post-apocalypse of, go northeast slightly to a single region of native ruins spread across 2 national monuments in 2 states. On the Utah side, you have Hovenweep with its castles. On the Colorado side, you have the extensive public lands and lonesome towers of Canyons of the Ancients. Hovenweep has well-defined clusters of ruins, but Canyons of the Ancients declines to even publish the locations of all but 3 of its ruin sites, so as to better preserve them through anonymity and obscurity. The tactic is to literally hide these things from the modern world, which is as well as they're able to do for preserving the structures on the budget they have. These are examples of yet another architectural style mastered by the Puebloan cultures who flourished from around 1200 to 1400 Common Era. But by the time European explorers came, their native guides warned them away from the crumbling ruins because they were in some way haunted. Whatever trauma caused the total abandonment of these dwellings is not agreed upon. Drought's the most common explanation, but it does nothing to explain why they were seldom, if ever, resettled in the years after. It's a mysterious place. But the structures are incredible, 700 years old or more, and built on top of boulders along a ravine, and yet they're still holding on, framing the burning colors of the Utah sunset perfectly through their slotted windows. How different the design of the community from something like Gunnison, which was divorced from the landscape with its angular box blocks, and divorced from time with its wide boulevards that would never see a skyscraper. Here, each building looks timeless in their age and decay because they were always in agreement with the conditions they were built in, just the right structure in just the right place for just the purpose it was built for. Now, though, most of those purposes are pretty inscrutable, and its builders absent for centuries. But the beauty remains, and the craftsmanship has endured the worst nature can throw at it, from wind to snow to rain to lightning. The most impressive ruins are out in Mesa Verde National Park, but for pretty obvious preservation reasons, the park is exceptionally unfriendly to dogs. It was too hot to leave them in the bus while we were there, so we had to stay out in the monuments where dogs are much more welcome, so long as you make sure they don't pee on an 800-year-old three-story tower. One day I'll be back, because as much as the ruins of my own civilization fascinate me, the leavings of the people who were here before offers an even greater demonstration of the awful power of time to erase, to topple, to wash away the best of what we accomplish in our individual lifetimes. Even if these towers stand tall another 800 years, they'll eventually end up just so much more of the fine desert soil, the dirt already rich with a million dead things, and a million dead places, and a million lost moments of being human, in a spiraling eternity that doesn't care very much at all whether a person exists or not. I'm in love with all ruined and forgotten places, but I've got a special affection for the places that feel also unmoored from memory. A couple hundred miles away from Canyons of the Ancients is a mountain pass with a dirt track winding through it where you can drive, essentially, inside the second largest living organism on Earth. The groves of aspen trees along Kebler Pass, just north of Gunnison as it happens, are all connected at the roots and grow as a single collaborative organism. Every single aspen tree you see up here is just a little piece of the larger whole. In this way, you can think of the pass as the head of a giant, with you tootling along between the hairs that thrust up out of its scalp. It's easy to say, oh, trees hardly count as impressive, but just stop for a minute and think just how science fiction-y this all sounds. Absurdity isn't limited to the human animal. An aspen grove of this size is just a straight-up bonkers way for a plant to live. Did I mention it's also been alive for hundreds upon hundreds of years? And stop to consider. I've talked about thousand-year-old cities, abyssal cracks in the earth, a creature that spans dozens of miles, and a cannibal folk hero, without having left the southwestern corner of Colorado. When I say the West is denser and larger than we can adequately address in art and the ways we have to explain things to each other, this is what I mean. The closer in you zoom, the more the details multiply and take on new form. The farther out you zoom, the weirder it all connects up. To have most pop culture originate from the coastal cities and to have most pop culture exclusively reference the coastal cities cuts us off from an understanding of the place we live and the people that live there that could be more comprehensive and ultimately more existentially useful. There is so much out here that makes America more coherent, that puts the peculiar experience of being an American in context with history and place. And it's all over, just lying around with a fading plaque out front explaining it to fewer and fewer interested passersby. Out of all the things I really absolutely can't stand about modern pop culture, the show Ancient Aliens is right at the top. When I was a kid, and goddamn do I sound old saying this, the History Channel broadcasts actual documentaries about actual history. I mean, yeah, 80% of them were on World War II, and another 10% were about how aluminum cans are made, but it was all trustworthy and useful information that helps the world make more sense, even if it's just a simple question like, where does my recycling go? But long before the age of Trump, the History Channel and other educational channels realized they could get a lot more eyes on the screen by peddling straight-up bullshit. The bullshit hit its apex in the widely reviled Mermaids, The Body Found, a 2011 Discovery Channel special that spent 2 hours explaining that the government was hiding the existence of mermaids and following a fake team of fake scientists dedicated to unearthing the real truth. Ancient Aliens is a longer-running show with hours and hours of interviews and montages where every relevant scientific discipline is misinterpreted and twisted in order to arrive at a conclusion where an audience member is more inclined to say, okay, sure, maybe aliens. Why not, right? Long before Trump, it was the History Channel that realized alternative facts were hot sellers and it paid to deal in them. Here's the thing that I think makes this all so poisonous. These are platforms that could use their reach to actually tell truths and explain things. The world is spectacularly confusing. It needs clarification. Maybe even especially about where the recycling goes, even if it's boring to some people. Ancient Aliens is constantly bringing up native mythology and history. It's one of the only shows on television where the age of the continent and the peculiarities of America's past peoples and eons are even discussed. but only ever in the context of the show fluffing up its own bullshit, of taking stories about creation and saying maybe it's about spaceships, of taking stories with a human moral and an actual meaning that could shed a lot of light on how we reckon with this landscape we've rooted ourselves in, and ignoring all of that to say that it proves that there were flying saucers back then, too. It adds to the confusion of modern living, not because it's believable at all, but because it takes actual fields like anthropology and geology and puts them on the same level as the guy who has one YouTube channel for showing you how to make the foil hats and one YouTube channel that's just hundreds of videos of him smoking a pipe. It makes it feel like nothing is true, and even if something is true, someone's always going to take it the wrong way, so why bother feeling strongly about the truth anyhow? This kind of media isn't merely stupid. It promotes a kind of ennui about whether history even means anything. It says that history isn't good enough without being dressed in fantasy and illusion. It makes it easier to forget that the place we live in and the stories of its bones and boulders are usually more fantastical than what we could even make up in the first place. Even when they're boring as dirt, at least these stories are real. I like this part of the travel the best, the driving around and being surprised at things. So it caught me off guard when I lost a longtime friend over my laissez-faire attitude towards getting the dishes done promptly when at camp. Kendra and I are both impulsive cleaners. We get it done, but rarely right away. And very slowly. This was driving a wedge between my friend who was caravanning with us in his own Volkswagen bus. I had figured separate buses, separate households. We each had one male human, one female human, one old dog, and one puppy per Volkswagen. But he had his way of doing things, and he eventually came to see my way of doing things as more of a moral failing than an annoyance. He came to Kendra and I up on Kebler Pass and demanded that we operate on a higher frequency, as he put it. Now, to merely have annoyed him would be one thing, a soluble thing, and we'd still be friends. But my friend went on to make clear that he was not merely annoyed, he was deeply disappointed in our entire character. Said I didn't feel like friends ought to judge each other that way, and he said the kind of thing that I'd only ever gotten in the comments section of YouTube. He said, and I quote, "Well, when you and Kendra die of diabetes at 40 because you're too fat to move, obviously I won't be your friend then anymore either." I was floored. How long had he been judging us like this? I mean, you don't say shit like that unless you've been brooding on it for a while, right? And I debated whether to include this exact phrasing of his complaint in the video, but I decided that it's important to note that in the course of my adventure, I could not escape the judgment of other people, not even at 9,000 feet above sea level, on a dirt road surrounded by people I love. That's a harsh lesson, but in the course of a real journey, it's always peaks and valleys of experience. The peaks are incredible. Experiences that are so vivid it seems like you learn new colors, and sights so bizarre you couldn't have dreamt them. But the valleys find you so small and so lost that you think you might have disappeared into some kind of, like the song says, nowhere land, making all your nowhere plans for nobody. When I pressed my friend on being out of line, he said the purpose of friendship is to make the other person better, and that he might not respect us now, but we could and should be better people, and we could earn his respect down the line that way. He said being healthy is all that matters, because that's life at its core, just the living physicality of it. He said depression isn't real, and that if I wasn't fat, I wouldn't be sad. He was very frustrated with how I live my life and see life, so not only did he give one goddamn whopper of an insult, he got up on his high horse and spiked down a philosophical and a moral wedge between us two. You get close to someone, you eventually say something stupid. That happens. It's life. We're human. It's forgivable and everyone moves on. Kendra and I never take seriously anything said between each other before coffee. But I don't understand a friendship based on someone you want the other person to be and not the kind of person they are now. So I drove away from him back in those Colorado hills, and I haven't actually spoken to him since. Kendra and I didn't really see that one coming, and were both wholly surprised by the severity of the fight. So, being close to Gunnison, we went back one more time. It was a really low moment. Kendra and I had made an agreement, way back when we began the trip, that if it was no longer fun for one of us, the other would relent, and we would go back. Kendra decided that she wanted to call in that agreement. It wasn't just the blowout argument. The road had been disagreeing with her for some time. Kendra, though, had a set of perfectly reasonable frustrations. A pillar of her argument was that she was tired of living in 70 square feet of space and regularly going 6 days or more without running water. And I really can't deny the weighty simplicity of that. A lot of comments on previous travel videos have been along the lines of, "This is cool, but I would never actually want to do it." And often you just can't really tell until you try. We had been on the road for 7 months at that point. That's more than giving it a fair shake. And Kendra went further. So long as we wrapped up before the snows hit, she wouldn't mind doing another few thousand miles in another few weeks. So I made a few amendments to the route that I had been wanting to travel with my friend, and came up with a condensed loop of Idaho, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Minnesota, with the diversions into western Nebraska and eastern Montana. It would be quick, but it would be doable. It wasn't the end of the trip here, but it sure as hell was the nadir of the entire thing. I want to talk about this because it's not really part of the social media aesthetic. The hashtag van life experience can easily slip into playing a kind of character, and while I've certainly put a bit of triumphalism into my own travelogues, I have tried to be as frank as I can about it. I've talked before about being frustrated by how Steinbeck and Abby and others omitted or fictionalized key details of their journeys, and how I didn't really get why they did that. Specifically, I didn't get why they omitted their wives, why Paul Thoreau has a whole riff on why it's quote-unquote best to travel alone. That part I now understand better. Part of that fantasy, that character, is being free from judgment, being the eternal stranger rattling down the road, and not accountable to anyone but yourself. In Kerouac's On the Road, he's constantly leaving a terrible impression and being a colossal dick, and it's fine for him because he'll just be somewhere new the next day. I had believed that freedom to be a fundamental part of the experience, and so I didn't actually notice that I was losing a friend every time I put dirty dishes back into the tub to clean later. Besides, marriage is a collaborative venture. To be mutually supportive, you can't actually just do anything and then say fuck all. A big part of the reason that Kendra wanted to go home was that she had spent 7 months in the passenger seat, and missed making her own money and missed having her own career, which is ultimately much more important than the flush toilet situation, and something that was important to me to give back to her. We were sharing an incredible experience together, but Kendra needed to be Kendra, and I wasn't going to deny her that. The two most common modern myths of nomadic travel, the Instagram myth of permanent smiles and the Kerouac myth of permanent unaccountability, those just don't really pan out when you actually spend months on the road, especially with other people. It's a hard going, but it's a wholly voluntary hardship. It's worth saying that I think most people are going to find a point where they do want to tap out, and have the assurance of a shower that they don't have to keep putting quarters into to keep running. All of that was kind of a lot. So our immediate and strongest impulse was that we needed to get the fuck out of Colorado that instant and get moving onto someplace exotic like Wyoming. But in a VW bus, it's not really a matter of just hitting the freeway and being there the next day. We had to go north, but we could either wind across the spine of the Rockies, or we could roll down onto the plains and then go straight up. But it's unthinkable to spend an entire summer in Colorado without visiting Rocky Mountains National Park itself. So we crossed over Monarch Pass again like we had back in the spring, and turned northwards once we were back on the Front Range. Kendra and I took a diversion up by Leadville and Mount Massive to a beautiful reservoir called Turquoise Lake. We found an amazing free campsite across the road from the lake and stayed there 3 days to string out our budget a little. We were close enough to Leadville to get their 4G service, and spent an afternoon swimming in the bracing cold of glacier water, followed by an evening snuggled up in the bus streaming Game of Thrones to Kendra's tablet. Especially in the wireless age, having a roadhouse with a good campsite can feel just as good as a house, if smaller. If you've got electricity to tap into, that is the real luxury. But 4G and Wi-Fi's wide availability, even in rural places, is a wild and surreal convenience that I'd never really imagined as a kid. It seems preposterous and magical that I ought to be able to rent movies on a raining night in the Colorado backwoods from my 44-year-old camper wagon, but it's as mundane as cell phones themselves now. Without anyone camping nearby, the dogs were free to roam, and our puppy discovered her talent for finding the most outrageously large bones around and bringing them back to the bus to gnaw on. Her skill would only improve with time. Leadville's way up there at 10,000 feet. This stretch of mountains, where the byways wind from valley to valley and the peaks go on in every direction, is far off of the beaten path. Rocky Mountain National Park is extraordinarily close to Denver, the biggest city in this part of the West by a good margin. But to approach the park from the back like we are, going through the Arapaho National Forest, the Rocky Mountains' uniqueness among mountains comes into focus. The high mountain country doesn't feel quite as high up as it is because everything is so uplifted. If your valley is Leadville, already at 10,000 feet, the peak at 14,000 feet seems regularly proportioned to it, not like the monolithic monster it is in aggregate. But Rocky Mountains actually do tower over the rest, even up here, in a titanic majesty. They aren't as imposing or dagger-sharp as other mountain ranges, but they rise up to a spectacular height in such a tremendous mass that the peaks aren't the point. The point is that they cradle a whole other secret realm, a kingdom of alpine tundra above where trees are able to grow and where, in the winter, freezing winds blow over 100 miles an hour. When you begin to climb at Grand Lake, you're already at or above the level of the West Coast's great mountain ranges. Back in Death Valley National Park, we had driven to the lowest spot in America at Badwater Basin, negative 300 feet above sea level. Now we would drive the highest drive that we could, the only paved public road in the U.S., above 12,000 feet. The Trail Ridge Road really is just an incredible little feat of human conquest. There are only a few short months in the summer when it's actually open. Usually it's so completely enveloped in ice and snow that it's completely inaccessible as well. There are long wooden poles lining portions of the road, maybe 10 or 15 feet high, that are meant to mark the road's position to snowshoers in late fall and spring. This road has been open every summer regardless since 1931, a kind of asphalt phoenix that rises again every summer from the field of white. It's not that you can see down all 12,000 feet, but you sure as hell can see 3,000 or 4,000 feet down at least. Yet you can feel the other 8. The air is thin and cold, like letting an ice cube melt in your mouth and trickle down. Our bus was deeply unhappy with the whole endeavor and kept dying on downhill stretches leading to tense moments where I had to coast down towards hairpin turns in true neutral while trying to get the bus turned over again, which it would generally oblige to do. If it hadn't turned out okay, I certainly wouldn't be here to tell you about it. But the bus never felt more inadequate and rickety than way up here, as close to orbit as a Volkswagen can achieve. The drop-off wasn't sheer, it wasn't a cliff, but it was an incline severe enough that there would be no stopping until you tumbled down to the bottom of the mountain if you managed to slide off the road. No matter how bundled up we were, the chill wind blew in and froze our toes through the 1,000 tiny gaps in the windows and up through the holes where the pedals swing down into the floor panel. This is August, just a few hundred miles to the east or west, and you're talking high 80s or low 90s for temperatures. Not up here. In the tundra above the tree line, the proliferation of tiny and tough wildflowers can find themselves with just 40 of 365 days to actually grow and take in sunlight. The Tundra Communities Trail is an interpretive trail about halfway along the ridgeline that functions as an open-air exhibition of the most amazing features of the biome in one little microcosm. You can hike out into the park for miles on wilder trails and get far from the sound of the Trail Ridge Road and the road network of the Eastern Park, but Trail Ridge Road is the way the broad majority of people experience the park. And why not? It's just about the most exotic environment you can visit without standing up on a single tank of gas worth of drive from the Denver airport. My dad worked a summer on Mackinac Island in Michigan as a teenager, and he and the other busboys coined a term for the tourists who drove up, came out, bought fudge, and immediately turned around and left again, having done the thing the place is famous for. He called these people the Fudgies. Believe me when I say that Rocky Mountain National Park is heaven for Fudgies. While Trail Ridge Road is a beautiful piece of engineering and an exhilarating, terrifying drive in its own right, it's this and its airport convenience that's led to the infamously congested popularity it enjoys. Plus, everyone who wants to visit has to do so within the same brief summer's window. After that, it's Grand Lake or Estes Park with no connecting thread between them. While Arches National Park is the subject of his rant, Edward Abbey's interlude from his 1968 masterwork Desert Solitaire titled Polemic, Industrial Tourism in the National Parks applies here almost more than anywhere else. It applies to me almost more than anyone else. The entire foundation of my trip is industrial tourism, as Abbey's about to tear into. He wrote, quote, "Industrial tourism is a threat to the national parks, but the chief victims of the system are the motorized tourists. They are being robbed and robbing themselves. So long as they are unwilling to crawl out of their cars, they will not discover the treasures of the national parks and will never escape the stress and turmoil of the urban-suburban complexes which they had hoped, presumably, to leave behind for a while. How to pry the tourists out of their automobiles, out of their back-breaking upholstered mechanized wheelchairs, and onto their feet, onto the strange warmth and solidity of Mother Earth again. This is the problem which the Park Service should confront directly, not evasively, and which it cannot resolve by simply submitting and conforming to the automobile habit. The automobile, which began as a transportation convenience, has become a bloody tyrant, 50,000 lives a year, and it is the responsibility of the Park Service, as well as that of everyone else concerned with preserving both wilderness and civilization, to begin a campaign of resistance. The automotive combine has almost succeeded in strangling our cities. We need not let it destroy our national parks. It will be objected that a constantly increasing population makes resistance and conservation a hopeless battle. This is true. Unless a way is found to stabilize the nation's population, the parks cannot be saved, or anything else worth a damn. Wilderness preservation, like 100 other good causes, will be forgotten under the overwhelming pressure of a struggle for mere survival and sanity in a completely urbanized, completely industrialized, ever more crowded environment. For my own part, I would rather take my chances in a thermonuclear war than live in such a world. No more cars in the national parks. Let the people walk. Or ride horses, bicycles, mules, wild pigs, anything, but keep the automobiles and the motorcycles and all their motorized relatives out. We have agreed not to drive our automobiles into cathedrals, concert halls, art museums, legislative assemblies, private bedrooms, and other sanctums of our culture. We should treat our national parks with the same deference, for they too are holy places. An increasingly pagan and hedonistic people, thank God, we are learning, finally, that the forests and mountains and desert canyons are holier than our churches. Therefore, let us behave accordingly. It is peculiar to be living the worst-case scenario envisioned by an author a generation back, but that certainly seems to be where we're at with all of this. It's easy to peg Abbey as misanthropic to the point of excess, but his heart is in the right place, and I say that as exactly the kind of person that Abbey's railing against in this polemic. The cultural moment in which this essay might have caught on is almost 50 years past, and personally, I'm grateful for the presence of the roads. I'm grateful for the compromise of sitting comfortably inside my climate-conditioned privacy box and still getting to see these places and know that they exist. Like most things in modernity, the window for how low you can go has radically shifted. In this instance, the bottom has completely dropped out on how low you can go with disconnection from nature. It's getting to the point where people who have never seen a tree that wasn't in a save-on parking lot is common, and they deserve a foothold. They deserve a place to start, and for many that foothold onto understanding the physicality of our world starts with piling together with a bunch of other teenage dirtbags into a battered Honda Civic and getting their minds blown out by the surprises and mysteries of the natural world in the national parks. When Abbey wrote his polemic, it was industrialization that was primarily divorcing us from nature. Industrialization is a quaint concern compared to the way we're woven together now, half a digital character of ourselves, half a media reality, more than capable of living a life without bothering to even acknowledge that nature is there. The fact that travel and adventure is such a popular category of social media expression shows that longing for nature is still there, at least, but it seems like just one more category of entertainment fiction from the distance of a screen. It's a level of abstraction way beyond having your car windows rolled up. And another 40 years from now, there's going to be some asshole doing this trip in a beat-up old Tesla telling you how that Gervais guy had it wrong, that it's eyeball holograms that are the real problem, and those guys, oh man, if those guys had any idea how much worse it could get, right? Nature is important to humans. It's important to sanity. It might be time to let go of the ecological puritanism of Abbey in favor of a doctrine that makes it better known that nature is still here, still available, at least for a little while longer. The experience sells itself once you're in it. It calls to deeply hidden needs and senses when the dappled sunlight comes through the trees and you smell the sap of them as you pass. If it speaks to you, by all means, get out, walk deeper. But if Abbey had gotten his way, I wouldn't have gotten a chance to see a third of what I've seen this trip, as incomplete as my experience of those places has sometimes been. Even if we disagree on the subject of America's automobile habit, and even if we disagree about every other damn thing there is to say about travel, Edward Abbey is not wrong about the deep spiritual importance of our open and primal spaces. The funny thing is, as snooty as Abbey gets about industrial tourism at large, it comes down to the tourist as to how they're actually going to play it. Kendra and I were about to run out of money, and so spent 6 days in one spot, holding down a pop-up homestead in Wyoming's Medicine Bow National Forest. Not the main one, the one closer to Cheyenne. And of course, Abbey is right about how much deeper the pleasure is in detail. After 6 days in the site, it was still beautiful, and different times of day and quality of light consistently showed new sides, the sagey green forest and the strange towers of rounded boulders. We were thrilled to finally be out of Colorado and cross the border on a Friday, expecting the money to come in the next day. But a banking holiday on the coming Monday meant that we wouldn't be paid ultimately until Wednesday. By the time Wednesday rolled around, we had no food, no water, no dog food, no stored electricity, no unread books, no cigarettes, and 2 gallons of gas. It was a strange feeling to be, about as true as it can be, out of everything. But it's not like we were at a loss for stuff to do. Beavers had dammed the stream running just downhill from our campsite, and a grove of trees was flooded out about waist deep. In the evenings, the moose would roam across the meadows in 2s or 3s, crying out their weird noises. And then the next day came, and when the heat was at its worst, we'd just take a picnic down at the groves of trees along the stream, shady and cool and indescribably relaxing. I'd never seen a forest quite like it before. It had a lot of dry, deserty qualities, but it was still green and vibrant, like an oasis on the high plains. Even if the mountains are long gone to the south when you're around Cheyenne, it's still at 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and the wind blows hard across these long sloping grasslands. until you get to Medicine Bow. And then these crazy boulders start popping up out of the grass and piling up, with trees and shrubs and all sorts of life making a home among them. One of the only sketchy things to happen on the trip happened on account of me trying to climb the tallest boulder pile around. There's only one way up to the top from the side I was on, and right at the top, I almost stepped in a pile of several days' worth of human shit and a scattering of bloody tampons. Scrambling around, it turns out that a guy and his rail-thin lady friend with that hollow tweaker stare had camped right on top of this rock pile and were deeply unhappy with my intrusion. The guy is mean-mugging me the whole time, and I figure, well, it's public land, right? And so I start doing a panorama with the camera. Then when I swing the camera around, the guy is still staring at me, except this time, he's holding an axe. We didn't exchange any words, but I took his body language to mean, maybe you ought to go back down the hill, so I obliged him on that. As crowded as the parks get, recreation is still just one of the reasons that people come out here. The classic Western desire to simply not be found and be a dirtbag in the relative privacy of wide-open nature still runs strong. I would just ask you to please bury your goddamn shit if you do. My encounter with the Axeman had wound down the vibe a bit, so Kendra and I took our last $5 bill and exit down the nearby freeway to try and get a pack of smokes at the Finn Deli gas station sandwich shop in the two-person hamlet of Buford. But the gas station was going out of business. He had 4 packs of cigarettes left, 3 packs of Marlboro Menthol, and 1 of Light 100s. The shelves were empty in all directions except for the occasional sundry like a box of black plastic garbage bags and a warm 12-pack of Diet Sprite. The lights were $6.80, but I asked if he'd take the 5, so he shrugged and said sold in a voice that wished a quick good riddance to both me and the smokes. And so it was that I bought one of the last 4 packs of cigarettes ever sold in Buford, Wyoming. These moments where you happen onto little turning points in history, even local microhistory like this, might not be common, but they leave quite an impression when you cross paths with one. We'd be saving the rest of our Wyoming adventure for later, after we had hit the edge of the Great Lakes and bounced back again. The Great Lakes is certainly where I think of the East beginning, the border between early America and the frontier. Geographically speaking, it's certainly close to the middle of it all. So to get the most out of our loop, we'd go north up to the Black Hills, where Mount Rushmore, Wind Cave National Park, and more were all clustered together in an uplift of ancient granite. But to get there, there's a lot of lightly traveled border roads going up and down the golden hills of the border between Wyoming and Nebraska. The Wyoming side seemed a little more populous and Wild West touristy, but on the Nebraska side was something called Toadstool Geologic Park. So as soon as we had gas in the tank, we bounced out of Cheyenne diagonally into the plains of western Nebraska. What I didn't realize was just how close the landscape was to that of the deserts of the Southwest, just a little less arid. The effect is like the difference between one of those weird hairless cats, the stark and sandy desert, and a cat with a luxurious coat of fur. The grasslands of the plains makes them look so inviting, even when the animal underneath is essentially the same as the barren deserts of Arizona. The age of the land is eerily reminiscent of Arizona, too. Agate Fossil Beds National Monument commemorates the widespread death that accompanied the birth of the plains as we know them today. 19 to 21 million years ago, in the Miocene epoch, the jungles and swamps that were once here dried up. As the last of the old landscape withered, hundreds of different species lay dead in heaps, creating boneyards where the skeletons lay 2 feet thick on the ground. All of this is right under the grass today. The Toadstool Park has formations that look incredibly similar to Petrified Forest National Park. I didn't expect Nebraska to be so visibly old and worn out, its jungles long evaporated. Continuing north, you reach the Sand Hills, some of the only parts of Nebraska that you'd actually call hilly. They're exactly what it says on the package, a field of sand dunes, permanently anchored at some point in the distant past by the flora of the prairie. Early homesteaders who had to work the soil wasted no time in calling this place a desert. Nebraska isn't what I'd imagine to be part of the western desert, but it absolutely is. There's something quite charismatically melancholy about the place, too, with its long shadows in the evening and its fine, chalky soil. It's impossibly quiet, too. Pridefulness is certainly a big part of the American character, but Midwesterners have long been known for a special kind of polite humility. I wonder if this landscape has something to do with it. The plains have a sense of total indifference to them, as if it couldn't matter less what stands on the thin layer of life between dirt and sky. The horizon is so total that every sunrise and every sunset shows off its full spectrum of colors, the passage of the day written in the changing hues. Nebraska's gentle, wind-worn hills are constant reminders that time is miserly. It can go a long time before yielding something helpful or new. It's a humbling kind of sensation, and it certainly makes the small rituals of please and thank you seem meaningful in the face of it. Of course, this is the West, so kindness and politeness don't really stay part of the story for very long. Continuing north, we reach the Black Hills. From the south, the hills are golden brown, but the way they gradually rise off the plains as you approach is hugely impressive, more so when the ancient gray granite begins to pierce the skin of the hills and reach out stony fingers towards the sky. Humans have been coming to the Black Hills for at least 11,000 years in nomadic tribes, but as far as anyone can tell, the first permanent settlers came in the 1500s, the Arikara tribe. By the time the mid-1800s roll around, the Sioux are fleeing from America's expansion, and the Sioux displace the Arikara. The Europeans came soon after. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, giving the Lakota Sioux protection from European settlement in the Black Hills. Quote, forever. A few years later, in 1875, gold was discovered, and that was how long forever lasted. The violation of the treaty prompted the last major conflict of the war between the United States and its indigenous population. This was the last place, and the last moment, where armed resistance might have made some difference, and the Sioux tried as hard as they could, but the U.S. simply signed another document in 1876, saying they were appropriating the land, and fuck any promises given before. With that tidy classification as appropriation and not gross violation of a national binding legal agreement, the cavalry moved in and a lot of killing was accomplished. There wasn't even much gold in the hills at all, and in the story's most depressing and predictable twist, gold mining quickly tapered off in the early 1900s despite all the bloodshed. It was replaced with tourism. And with good reason. The Black Hills are denser with natural beauty than anything for hundreds of miles around in any direction. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that we had, whoopsie, actually violated the rights of the Lakota Sioux by seizing the land that we said they could have forever. A settlement of $106 million was awarded to the tribe. But the tribe never accepted the money. They still haven't. The sum is now, with interest, over $1.2 billion, sitting in a bank account and waiting to be touched. But the Sioux want the land back. Big as that monetary number is, sensical as it is from the abstraction of average price per acre for this sort of land, the settlement was every bit as insulting to the Sioux as it sounds. Land is as close to eternal as you get. Home is beyond value. They don't want a damn cash handout, they want the Black Hills back. Native reservations are like states within a state, where they operate independently of all other local agencies, but the borders are open and you can come and go as you please, no passport or bureaucratic overhead needed. If we did give the land to the Sioux, or even the scattered descendants of the Arikara, the accessibility of natural wonders within the Black Hills would not actually change very much. But now you've got European Americans all over the place, almost 250,000 of them all told, across the dozen or so towns in and around the hills. And what would they say if the Supreme Court simply appropriated their land? Why, wouldn't that be unfair, exploitative, callous, cruel? Of course it would be. All those things and more. Yet it would be just a very small taste of how our country has behaved in its past campaigns of voracious expansion. Like the imprecise borders radiating out from four corners, courts feel that if we've been living that way for so long, why change anything? Even if how the thing was formed was fundamentally wrong. In 2017, it's easy to get carried away by a feeling of surprise when confronted with a government that regularly breaks promises to prioritize ignorance and cruelty, but there's nothing really new about it. If this moment of our cultural history strikes you as especially ugly, consider that we were so thorough in the bloodshed of our yesterdays that the crusty and genuinely villainous 19th century America was able to rebrand itself into a charismatic and confident 20th century version without ever having to hear a loud objection. Maybe we aren't changing. Maybe we're just tearing down some of our more complimentary self-illusions. Today, the Black Hills are most known for being the epicenter of the annual Sturgis motorcycle rally. Back in the 19th century, there was a kind of convention and party for fur traders called the Rendezvous, a week where the fur companies would buy pelts for a tiny, tiny price and then sell wildly overpriced liquor to the trappers, while they indulge in a bacchanal of drinking, storytelling, and, as Kesha might put it, gettin' sleazy. There's a yearly reenactment of Rendezvous out towards Minnesota, but the reenactment is more about playing frontier dress-up than rough-riding men and women pouring out of every corner of the West to get obscenely shit-faced. The Sturgis Rally is the true heir of the Rendezvous. Overpriced alcohol and all. We had missed the rally itself, which I'm glad of. Over 1 million bikers show up for it, and the Black Hills feel crowded at even a quarter of that many tourists. Bikers are all over the hills regardless of when you come. It's kind of a mecca for the Harley-Davidson crowd. But to get the most out of the Black Hills, you need moments of quiet and the freedom of a leisurely pace. With 1 million people in the hills, that's going to be hard to find, but possible. The Black Hills offer some unique and remarkable natural sights both above and below ground. Wind Cave National Park is primarily about the cave, sure, but its splendor is spread across both worlds pretty evenly. The park protects a huge chunk of the southern hills, providing refuge for buffalo, pronghorns, foxes, groundhogs, and what seems like hundreds of different sorts of birds. The dirt road that winds through the many acres of the park's backcountry is one of the most beautiful of the entire trip, as I've seen it. And even in September, it was one of the quietest roads, too. We didn't encounter another car on the drive until it tapers off into private ranch land about 20 miles from its beginning. We saw more wildlife that day than we had the entire previous 9,000 miles combined. The buffalo grazed right along the road and lay clustered in herds just beyond it. Buffalo are one of the few symbols of the American West where we acknowledge a past wrongdoing. Settlers and hunters nearly drove the buffalo to total extinction. There used to be herds numbering in the thousands, but it was not uncommon in the throes of manifest destiny to slaughter that entire number in a day, driving them into a killing zone and firing round after round into the herd until they were all dead. But the bison are still here, and holy shit, they are huge! There's something still very wild about them, and they've got a gaze that's so much more active and critical than cows and other thoroughly domesticated animals. Don't get me wrong, you can still get a buffalo burger. They're not so close to being extinct that you can't have one with fries and a Coke. But that is the dynamic at play with so much of what's out here. There's something about America as a place, with its millions of years of accumulated wonders and oddities, that is truly unique and absolutely transfixing. But it's industrialization, the explosion of machine-driven progress that took us from having never crossed the continent from one side to the other, to laying freeways across it in just 5 or 6 generations. Industrial progress looks at everything, including people, as a resource. You look at buffalo, what's it got? Leather, lots of leather. Meat, pretty tasty meat too, to be honest. What's it like? Well, it's too strong and too large to control like cattle, and it's more clever and willful than a cow. So that's not great. Their larger bulk does not make up for the fact that they aren't especially docile. So buffalo are out, slaughtered down to a scant few in just a couple of decades, and cows are in. Cow and cowboy are such a fundamental part of the Western image that it is easy to forget that both of them are missing from America's original cast list. It's only places like these national parks that preserve the buffalo as something other than a novelty burger meat, that preserves them as a symbolic part of the land itself. Buffalo here wander alongside pronghorn, giving an impression of a kind of alternate reality African savanna. Seen from above, the so-called flyover states are a quilt of square farms stretching from horizon to horizon. Places like Wind Cave are glimpses of what the endless farmland was like back when it was an ocean of grass, before our obsession with right angles took the majesty and exoticism out of our perception of South Dakota and consigned it to being just another Midwestern nowhere in our cultural understanding of it. Underneath the surface, Wind Cave is unlike anywhere on Earth. There's a special kind of cave feature called boxwork, an incredibly delicate formation that's like if a brick eroded and left its basic shape behind with some other lacy ridges of thin stone. What seems to be happening with boxwork is that acid will erode the bedrock, but crystalline calcite resists the action and stays stranded behind. Wind Cave has 97% of the world's known boxwork. There's a little over at Jewel Cave a few dozen miles away, and some in caves abroad, but for the most part, this is the only cave in the world that produces this particular feature in bulk. The processes that left behind the boxwork also didn't leave behind any traditional cave features like stalactites and columns and such either, making for a really unique feel inside the cave. Wind Cave itself is spectacularly confusing and winding, and our ranger guide noted that it's easy to get lost just a minute or so after having left a defined path. The architecture of the space simply makes no sense by human standards. It's the random work of slow acids and geologic time. When the granite of the hills was uplifted, it tilted the newer limestone close to the surface at an angle as it pushed through, opening up all these pockets and hollows that the acidic process eventually connected into a vast network. Yet something unusual and special happened at Wind Cave. Jewel Cave is in the same ring of limestone that surrounds the granite center of the hills, but it's full of those traditional cave features, and its calcite formed spar in preference to the boxwork. Spar is a kind of small crystal that has no value or use. Jewel Cave was in private hands for much longer than it was in public land, and it was only the fact that nothing in the cave was worth mining that preserved it. The only value is that it's intensely and spectacularly cool-looking. Being inside either cave is an otherworldly experience, and each offers a distinct kind of environment from one another. Traveling through Jewel Cave is like taking a mile-long hike through a geode. Traveling through Wind Cave is like slipping behind the floorboards of the earth into a dark and secretive in-between space. It's wild to me that two such incredibly different places could form so close to one another. But rocks have a logic all their own, and there are people who devote their entire professional lives to just the eccentricities of this particular region's geology. There's more than enough complexity here to fill that time. Both these caves are still being mapped and explored. Their depths are still mysterious. I always knew that science fiction and fantasy often reference the wonders of our old natural world and then make imaginative exaggerations to them, but it took fully the whole trip for me to realize just how much fantasy actually lives in reality, how little amendment is really needed to find something alien and exotic out here in nature. Underground spaces are especially alien, parts of the earth wholly removed from light and life. On top is that home where the buffalo roam, a classic and enduringly ancient piece of the West. But underneath is a pitch-black labyrinth where direction has no meaning, and rock formations as delicate and fragile as lace endure for millions of years. The permanence of rock has its own spiritual appeal. Think of how we use it in architecture, to create an edifice that intimidates or inspires or otherwise says, "The business that takes place here is greater than any one fleshy human in their short, sad life." So it isn't especially surprising that our nation, not even 300 years old, was pretty insistent on carving the faces of our most esteemed leaders on the billion-year-old rock at the core of the hills. Mount Rushmore is one of the most notable tourist attractions in America, and for an awful lot of folks, one of the most disappointing as well. It attracts close to 2 million tourists a year, but I imagine the average visit of those tourists to be about 15 minutes. The faces are not jaw-dropping works of inhuman majesty. They're much more humble than that. And I think that's much to Mount Rushmore's benefit. Instead of seeking to be greater than the rock that holds them, the likenesses seem to just emerge from within it. It gives exactly the impression it was meant to, the impression that our greatness as a country is tied to the land, and that the greatness of the land is tied to our civic qualities as a people. That really isn't true. The rock had, after all, minded its own business perfectly well for about a third of the history of the planet, yet Mount Rushmore conveys the message charismatically and well. The way the light hits the faces in the late afternoon, probably even more so in the mornings, enhances the deliberate mythology of the place with natural beauty and leans on the credibility of nature to justify our human doings. It's a real modern sphinx, complete with a temple-like viewing platform and a highly ceremonial walk down a boulevard bearing every state flag and the date of each state's incorporation into the Union. The Mount Rushmore experience is one of contemplative symbolism. There's not a lot to do, but look at the faces and think about whether or not they actually mean anything to you. This is, of course, anathema to the fudgies, who fill the gift shop full to bursting, but leave the actual viewing pavilion relatively uncrowded. I've asked a few people who have been to Mount Rushmore how they enjoyed it, and nonplussed is about the average emotional temperature of folks who've been there. The faces are larger than life, but not larger than landscape, and I think a lot of people are thrown by that. Their presence is quieter, their purpose more abstract than the postcard impression of them as some kind of Vegas-esque unreality imposed on the mountain. 17 miles away, the Oglala Lakota have been spending the past few decades turning Thunderhead Mountain into a monument of their own, a towering representation of Chief Crazy Horse that already dwarfs the European-American monument. The scale is much larger. Crazy Horse's head is already half again as large as Washington's, and they plan to carve Crazy Horse's entire body, as well as the horse he is riding on, out of the mountainside as well before it's done. If the Crazy Horse Monument ever wraps its construction, which, considering the patience of the Oglala, is pretty likely, they'll have a statue that's fully as impressive as people expect Rushmore to be. It'll be, in a flatly literal way, a mountain of a man. The fascinating thing here is that some of the Oglala object to the monument, saying that if you really wanted to respect what Crazy Horse stood for, you would have left Thunderhead Mountain the hell alone. And I do wonder about that. Wanting to build a monument like this, something by humans to impress other humans, is kind of an old-world thing. And there's a certain sense of trying to beat Mount Rushmore at its own game going into the construction. Henry Standing Bear, the visionary artist behind the monument, wrote in a letter to a sculptor who had worked on Mount Rushmore, quote, "My fellow chiefs and I would like the white man to know that the red man has great heroes too." That is a noble goal, certainly, but I also kind of agree that the monument never would have existed if Crazy Horse had found more concrete success in his defense of his culture. That even if its message is all Oglala, its delivery is spoken in the language of the conquerors. Although the poem has become kind of a pseudo-intellectual meme, it's even quoted in Call of Duty Black Ops 3 for God's sake, it was impossible for me to see the Black Hills monuments without referring back to Percy Shelley's ultra-classic 1818 poem of Age and Decay, Ozymandias. Indulge me for a minute if you're willing. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretch far away. So what happens, then, when Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Crazy Horse are all forgotten, and the symbolic meaning of these works becomes lost to time? Luckily, one needs only drive a day or two into Wyoming for an answer. Earlier, when Kendra and I were out at Medicine Bow, we went by the Ames Monument, a squat stone pyramid dedicated to the glory of long-dead railroad executives as part of a public relations stunt over 100 years ago. It lies just about as close to the middle of nowhere as you can get, its brown stone in sharp relief against the cutting blue of the sky and the dappled gray and green of the lichen-colored boulders in the far distance. There were two Ames brothers, one who held down the title of railroad executive and one who used his position in the United States Senate to pursue the agenda of the Union Pacific Railroad. Oliver and Oakes Ames made their fortune selling shovels to miners during the California Gold Rush, which is itself a kind of ironic look at who won and who lost that competitive frenzy of resource speculation. The guys with a warehouse full of shovels made out so well that they took over ownership of the country's biggest railroad. With Oakes in the Senate and Oliver in the main office, they quickly sought and won the contract to construct the first transcontinental railroad. It was an unbelievably complex feat of engineering, although it is important to note that it was done using labor practices little better than slavery. The Ames brothers charged the government about $50 million more than it took to actually build the railroad, in 19th century dollars, which stayed hidden for several years due to the many bribes that the Oakes brothers were giving their fellow congressmen. When this con came to light, the Oakes brothers were disgraced. This lonely spot on the high plains of Wyoming was actually the tallest point that the railroad would pass through on its way from one side of the country to the other, and so a small town was built for switching out the train's engines after tying them out on the long climb from the lower plains. This took about an hour, so passengers were encouraged to get out and take in the sight of this ridiculous Midwestern ziggurat, dedicated to showing the passengers that, no matter what they may have heard about Oakes and Olivers, these were great men anyway, and should be respected. If they weren't great, why would they have their own pyramid? Huh? Gotcha there. So what we actually have here is corporate PR from over 100 years ago, already missing almost every shred of context it began with. 20 years after the pyramid was completed, the tracks were moved and the town dismantled, leaving the pyramid to sit and molder alongside the ancient boulder piles that surround it. There's even a secret room in the center of it, the entrance walled off and lost to time, like a classic Egyptian pyramid. Shelley's poem is about a statue of Ramses II. The deserts that Shelley talked about were those of ancient Egypt. But as far as cruel taskmasters of the distant past are concerned, the Ames brothers and Ramses II are on a similar kind of level. Their great successes were built on the broken backs of the less fortunate, their lofty position was a front for a deep lust for money and power, and in either case, time and the earth care not one bit about their lives or their passing. Of the train tracks on which the Ames brothers built their fortune and their legend, nothing remains, while the lone and rolling plains stretch far away. Nature leaves behind its own monuments as well, and few so dramatic as Devil's Tower. It's generally considered to be part of the Black Hills Recreation Area, although you do have to go 100 miles west into Wyoming from the main hills to get there. You can immediately see why, though. It was declared the first national monument in 1906. Even out in the chaos and complexity of the West geology, there's nothing else quite like this singular stone tower, rising defiantly out of the hills with its sharp-angled and deeply rutted surface. Devil's Tower is so unusual a formation that there isn't 100% agreement on how it came to be in the first place, but it is agreed upon that it's all volcanic material that cooled underground, forming the hexagon columns that give the tower its unique character. The most recent theory goes that it's a volcanic plug, a section of magma that cools within the vent of an active volcano, capping it off and causing a tremendous pressure buildup underneath. Older theories figure it's a laccolith, a kind of common upwelling of lava into the sandstone that covers much of the West, back when it was an ocean some 200 million years ago. Common laccoliths just don't quite turn out so singular and striking, though, and if it was a plug, the evidence of volcanic materials that would have had to vent around the plug eroded long ago and are no longer evident. It's a curiosity, aesthetically and geologically, but either way, geologists agree that for many millions of years it lay buried under the soil until inch by inch erosion did its work on the much softer sandstone around it. And now, here it is. It's been visible for as long as people have lived in the area. Every local tribe has a myth of some kind about it, and most of them agree on the detail that the tower is so marked because it was attacked by a great bear of tremendous proportions who was trying to get at people on top, and those people appealed to the Great Spirit for help and raised this tower up farther and farther away from the bear. Today, climbers go up and down the thing semi-frequently, although to the objections of local tribes who find it very disrespectful of them to do so. As a compromise, there's a voluntary climbing break in June, while tribes conduct traditional ceremonies, so they don't have to watch these folks winching themselves up and down a sacred feature as they try to connect to their past. Devil's Tower is much like the Grand Canyon in that, despite being a famous postcard image, being in its presence is still so much more than what an image conveys. It impresses, it provokes a lot of thought on the age of the world around us, and what may still be hidden beneath our feet. When Devil's Tower has crumbled to dust, what new thing will scratch the roof of its dirt coffin and breach into daylight? Climbers have uploaded videos of the top of the tower on YouTube, and I really recommend watching some of them. I dislike heights, and have always been impressed with the tremendous and stoic adventurousness of climbers, but I'll never be one. It's a truly hidden, secret place up there, windswept and lonely. As far as monuments go, Devil's Tower has the clearest messaging out of all the ones I've just covered. It will never lose its context. Devil's Tower tells us that we are living in a place larger and stranger than we'll ever really understand. And I believe in the endurance of that truth more than I do Washington's. Long may his face cast its stony shadow. Mystery isn't quite the same thing as ignorance, though, and my search for footage of the top of Devil's Tower led me to a thing that left my jaw hanging open. The video is titled, "What You Need to Know About Giant Ancient Tree Stumps." You won't believe it! And you know what? He's right. I did not believe it. The video has 1,655,979 views as I'm writing this, and its thesis says that although some egghead geologist will tell you that this is an igneous intrusion, it's obvious to all those with eyes who think critically that it is in fact an ancient tree stump for a giant tree that reached almost into orbit, and the real question here is what race of giants cut the tree down and where did they go? What are these so-called geologists not telling you? Why are they hiding the role of giant men in loincloths with axes in the formation of Devil's Tower? This is after admitting that the thing is made of igneous rock in the first 30 seconds of the video, by the way. I'm a fan of mythology because it's an allegorical and artistic way to grapple with questions that, without science, we can't really begin to answer. With science, with a process of inquiry where the state of reality can be agreed on through testing and peer review, a lot of things become clear. Devil's Tower is mysterious, its geology somewhat incomplete, but saying we don't know for certain exactly how this giant homogeneous blob of igneous rock came to be, but it's definitely lava-related, is a far cry from, well, I think it's obvious to everyone in the room that this looks like a tree stump, so, I mean, there you go. In talking about how deep time goes, how much history there is to Earth, and how new we are in comparison to it, this is something we understand better now thanks to the rational science of geology. Geologists read the landscape like a book. If you learn the lexicon of rocks, the rocks explain themselves. That's why the western deserts are such a draw for the discipline. All this self-explanation is sitting right on the surface, eroded into spectacular display. It takes minutes to Google Devil's Tower and get the basics off either the Park Service website or even Wikipedia, and then immediately find hundreds of more complicated things by people who have spent years of their lives pursuing a degree in geology and then studying Devil's Tower specifically just by following the trail of sources out from their summaries on the main websites. And yet, I don't think the National Park website gets the kind of traffic this video does. At the end, the creator has a bit of scrolling text that says, "This is really a lot to digest, folks. But do understand this is just a theory. I believe people are more than clever, and so is the design of our world." There's a thematic thread running through shit like this and Ancient Aliens that the greatest intellectual value is uncritical open-mindedness to literally any idea. That the truly clever and truly awake are those who would never immediately dismiss the argument that the world's mesas are the stumps of trees all cut down by a race of giants or maybe aliens. This is neither science nor mythology. There is no artistic component to it, nothing being said that's culturally significant or emotionally meaningful, that connects the individual to the unknown, even through fantasy. It doesn't seek to tell a story of any kind. It completely dismisses the actual science that explains 90% of the thing, and casts a preference for that kind of actual science as the mark of an ignorant and small-minded simpleton who believes whatever those nefarious geologists will tell them. I grew up in a world where the face of ignorance in America was fundamentalist Christianity, because Christianity was convinced that it had the whole truth of everything in a single book. I got beat up a couple times in middle school because I was, capital letters, the kid who didn't believe in God. But this conspiratorial rejection of all professional opinion is something new to me, something I never expected and don't know how to really even process. The comment section of almost every video about Devil's Tower, even if it's people just uploading vacation footage, at least in the first couple search pages, are filled with people going off about the tree stump thing. What happens when the stories that we tell ourselves not only give up on truth, but give up on meaning as well? What happens when we collectively look at the world around us and genuinely don't give a single shit about understanding it, even allegorically? Nobody told me eastern Montana was a desert, for example, but I'm not going to waste breath pretending that since I've told you this, now you and I share a secret bond of knowledge over the real truth of eastern Montana that they don't want you to know about. There are just very few people who care much about eastern Montana at all, and of the ones that do, not a lot of them are really loud about it on the internet. Everything people think about when they think Montana is out on the western side. They've got Glacier National Park, massive forests, the wide swooping hills that give you that big sky country impression. East of that, it gets flat, then it gets dry, then it gets old. That feeling of truly ancient decay you only get when the mountains are completely eroded into sullen heaps of hard rock skirted with granular mounds of their former glory. Taking Route 323 through Bell Tower and Ichlaca reminded me of New Mexico more than any green or mountainous state, and the area has that distinctly West Texas habit of marking towns on the map that do not seem to physically exist at all when you drive underneath the letters of the label. But physically, we're north of Portland, Oregon here. I've been reading Stephen King's Dark Tower books slowly as we went along, and they had the eerie effect of being somewhat prescient for a lot of what I saw, both physically and philosophically. There's a lot I get frustrated with in the books, structurally especially, but they do deserve their place in pop culture mythology. Unlike the video I was talking about, they're an on-reality and a make-believe that does meaningfully distill and explain more than a few parts of the experience of the American landscape and American decay. I was on the 5th book, Wolves of the Cala, and in it there's a made-up author named Benjamin Slightman Jr. who writes books out on his ranch in Montana. Meanwhile, the main characters are in a place called Cala Bryn Sturgis, part of a region called the Crescent. The series puts Roland's journey in his own when and where on a path from Inworld, a civilized place long ago brought low, to Midworld, a kind of decayed, woodsy no-man's land, then the Crescent, then the awful wastelands of the Thunderclap, and then Endworld, where reality breaks down and, ends. The Crescent is, well, a crescent of habitable plains and deserts where small farming and ranching communities still hang on to civilization. I thought that was such a weird idea, a big strip of north-south landscape that's consistently similar and kind of culturally homogeneous. Ben Slightman is a character in that when and where of the Crescent, a doppelganger for his Montana version, which makes it likely that the Cala is actually a dead ringer from Montana as well. The reality of the American landscape is that what we conceive of as the West isn't just the Southwest and the big deserts within driving distance of Hollywood. There's desert in Idaho, in Montana, in North Dakota, in Nebraska. The landscape of the West truly does lie in a crescent before and then after the mountains of the Continental Divide. Something I had taken for imagination at first was actually allegorical and accurate in the allegory to the landscape that passed under the wheels of the Volkswagen. I loved it out here. It has a kind of jagged and weather-beaten beauty to it that's much intensified by its emptiness and anonymity. This is the land where Theodore Roosevelt went to grieve and become the man that they carved into the mountain. In southwestern North Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt National Park protects the Badlands around ranches owned by Roosevelt at two important times in his life. The southern unit of the park preserves the ranch house where he went as a young congressman after his mother and his wife died in the same year, leaving him doubly bereft. Out here in the Badlands, he went on cattle drives and hunted buffalo, even served time as a frontier sheriff. This was the land where he came into his knowledge of himself, into his values as a human being. He wrote, quote, "The Badlands grade all the way from those that are almost rolling in character to those that are so fantastically broken in form and so bizarre in color as to seem to hardly properly belong to the earth. I heartily enjoy this life, with its perfect freedom, for I am very fond of hunting, and there are few sensations I prefer to that of galloping over these rolling, limitless prairies with rifle in hand, or winding my way among barren, fantastic, and grimly picturesque deserts of the so-called Bad Lands. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm." Teddy Roosevelt is my favorite of any American president, and for that reason. He loved this place as powerfully as anyone can love a place, and he knew this country better than almost anyone who's occupied the office of president. There was no risk that he could ask of his country or his men that he did not himself risk. He led an all-volunteer cavalry group during the Spanish-American War, his military career culminating with the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898, where he defied both the odds and good sense by leading a cavalry charge up a hill defended by 700 men with bolt-action rifles. And yet he won the day with few casualties. It won him such acclaim that he was asked to be vice president to McKinley. When McKinley was shot by an avowed anarchist, Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt himself gave most of the credit for that fateful afternoon back at San Juan Hill to the guy in charge of the Gatling guns, however, in a quote that feels balanced right on the knife's edge between the modern world and the 19th century. Roosevelt said, quote, "I think Parker deserves rather more credit than any other one man in the entire campaign. He had the rare good judgment and foresight to see the possibilities of the machine guns. He then, by his own exertions, got it to the front and proved that it could do invaluable work on the field of battle, as much in attack as in defense. While thus firing, there suddenly smote on our ears a peculiar drumming sound. One or two of the men cried out, 'The Spanish machine guns!' But after listening a moment, I leaped to my feet and said, 'It's the Gatlings, men! Our Gatlings!' Immediately the troopers began to cheer lustily, for the sound was most inspiring." Theodore Roosevelt is the rare individual who threads the needle between men like the Ames brothers and men like John Muir. He was a man of appetites and enthusiasms, as uncritically in love with technology and the race to see who could change the world the fastest as any American, but he also credits the land for giving him his salt and his vision. He reserves his deepest sentiment for the natural beauty that he can't quite even put into words. He took the national park system and made it a permanent pillar of the American experience. He essentially invented the modern doctrine of natural conservation through bureaucracy. Yet he ran on a ticket of American exceptionalism and his reputation as a war hero. The lands that he loved were ones just decades removed from the genocide of their native populations. The good and the bad of the American spirit, of American frontiersmanship and expansion, as well as the charismatic energy with which Roosevelt was unabashedly a champion for a more rural American perspective, it all fits within the container of a single human being. He was an intellectual who loved going to war. He was a conservationist who shot buffalo. He was a politician who cared much more about the prairie than the parlor. The most preposterous thing about this country is that its contradictory dreams and ideals are not always fantasy, that sometimes the literary and thematic ways we understand the West and the American character to be manifests itself into a flesh and blood person. Theodore Roosevelt was not larger than life. He was just a man, and he lived. But he was such a complex and interesting man that he seems to me much larger than that face in the rock 100 miles to the south. Of conservation in the parks, Roosevelt wrote, "We have become great because of the lavish use of our resources, but the time has come to inquire seriously what will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are all exhausted, when the soils have still further impoverished and washed into the streams, polluting the rivers, denuding the fields, and obstructing navigation. It is also vandalism, wantonly to destroy or permit the destruction of what is beautiful in nature, whether it be a cliff, a forest, or a species of mammal or bird. Here in the United States, we turn our rivers and streams into sewers and dumping grounds. We pollute the air, we destroy forests, and exterminate fishes, birds, and mammals, not to speak of vulgarizing charming landscapes with hideous advertisements. But it looks as if our people are awakening. If we had awakened, we are certainly asleep again. But Roosevelt's legacy endures in the form of all this public land I've been roaming in between and living off of, all these wonders and surprises that have been deliberately preserved for the future that I'm a part of. Teddy Roosevelt found the uniqueness of our culture to be symbiotically tied to the uniqueness of our land, and to destroy one is to destroy the other. The American values that I consider worthwhile and ennobling all certainly seem tied to landscape. Values like self-reliance, humility, neighborly compassion, curiosity. These are things that are tied to our cultural memory of being a nation where civilization is just a coastal thing, and the deeper you go, the more on your own you are, and the more strange things get. Where the more important it becomes to help the few people who are struggling alongside you. But this vision also glosses over, the genocide. What's frustratingly painful about modern America is that I think that there's much that's truly worthwhile and universal in our self-mythology, in our self-conception, in the idea of America. But the more history you get into, the more obvious it is that we have always applied our freedoms incompletely, and that our ideals haven't really had all that much bearing on how we behave. The 1-2 punch of a popular culture where nothing is true, and a political culture where nothing is sacred, makes this more obvious. But as much as it feels like 2017 is the year it all fell apart, my experience on the road has taught me that none of this is really especially new. At the same time, it makes me especially fascinated with figures like Roosevelt, who truly believed in the whole philosophy of the American experiment. I've been watching reruns of The West Wing, and even though it's just a few years old now, it seems almost shocking in how aspirational and genuine it was. It really believes in all this America shit. Believes that through honesty and through empathy, the old American promises can still come true. The trick of it all is that as a nation, we're trying to live up to these grand ideals of the Enlightenment, while simultaneously trying not to be so damn hypocritical about it as the Founding Fathers actually were. The central idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is beautiful. It's a worthy thing. A nation can't guarantee happiness, but it can try and make it so as many people as possible can have their best shot at it. It's too much to live up to completely across the chaos of millions upon millions of people, but the point of civic life is to at least try. To at least try to better yourself and to better your country. The 19th century was a mean one, and while Roosevelt was waist-deep in some of its meanness, he still transcended its pettiness to live up to a greater ideal that he really, truly believed in. It didn't matter that he came from a world filled with ignorance and cruelty. He believed it could be better, and he worked his ass off to make it that way. After his presidency, Roosevelt came back here to the Elkhorn Ranch, which is still in operation today with descendants of his original herd of cattle. Out here in the Badlands, where time does its work across eons and moves slow, it's hard not to wonder if there's anything in the human realm equally as timeless. Can something as intangible as liberty last as long as these hills? I haven't arrived at an answer, but I would desperately like there to be an answer. The national parks exist, specifically in Roosevelt's vision, so that we can come out here and ask that question. The best way to see the Badlands is to get lost trying to find them. Kendra and I ended up deciding that we wanted to cut off a big chunk of the freeway and drive from out of the hills directly south of Medora on our way to Teddy Roosevelt. The roads were drawn differently on my National Geographic Atlas than they were on my folding map from AAA, and neither map was ultimately accurate to how those roads look when you get out into the dirt network of the hills. We came up past the burning coal vein campground and finally settled along a route winding around the course of the Little Missouri River. The dirt of the roads was a deep red, and the trees along the route were starting to turn their fall colors. There was no one else out there besides a couple scattered ranches and some free-grazing cows who wandered across the road. But it was my first glimpse of a Badlands landscape, and I didn't really even know what I was looking at for the first couple of miles. It looked as if someone had tossed a bowl full of acid onto the plains, and it drove deep wounds and rivulets into the surface, cutting jagged hunks out of the rolling plains and leaving heaps of tortured rock in its place. Had I seen them as part of the park, I would have been bracing to see something unusual already. Seeing them unexpectedly out here, driving in and out of them on a deserted dirt path, going past green groves of cottonwoods by the river and huge dry gulches with angry spires of old stone a hill away, this left a deeper and more abiding impression on me. The Badlands in the park itself are lusher and more beautiful than the southern Badlands, and although they're certainly strange, there's still something warm and welcoming about those Badlands in the park. It may look like another planet, but you'd guess it to be a habitable one. The hidden Badlands, out the East River Road south of Medora, are more arid and less dramatic, but their solitude and quiet is something it's harder to get within the park without really hiking a few miles. The park is right off the freeway, and its scenic loop is always packed, despite the relative obscurity of the park compared to ones that are closer to major cities. The north unit of Teddy Roosevelt is 100 miles up the road still, but it's well worth visiting as well to get a glimpse of the most verdant Badland of them all. Up above the Badlands, the plains just roll on and on. But inside the meandering spread of the Badlands themselves is an oasis of cottonwood groves and fields of flowers. Buffalo herds wander everywhere, including across the byway. After 20 minutes waiting for a herd to pass, I eventually decided to try and putter the bus down a lane when the buffalo had cleared it. It was surreal. I had begun the trip never having seen one of these creatures, and now here I was, so close I could reach out and touch one if I so dared to do so. I had my 29th birthday in the park, and Kendra made me an adorable handmade birthday card and a fine breakfast. With a finite definition to the trip now, Kendra was in wonderful spirits, and we were both captivated by being somewhere so truly exotic. We didn't know what to expect from the Dakotas, and they over-delivered so totally that it was disorienting. A birthday previous, the bus hadn't even been in good enough shape to turn over. The trip was still a plan back then. I had never driven a stick shift yet. But the trip had been 5 years in total putting together, keeping the dream alive through years of low-paying jobs and the monotony that comes with being perpetually broke. Now we had done it. We were nearly 10,000 miles deep into our journey, and I realized something. I had accomplished my lifelong dream before 30. I had done everything that I wanted to do for so long in life. And I had spent so much of my life trying to put myself in this position that I find myself in, that I had never really bothered to think about it afterwards. It was more than I wanted to think about at the time. I was of the mind that if I had spent my entire adult life trying to get to North Dakota, that I probably ought to just take it in and enjoy North Dakota. So that's what I tried to do. I put the pedal to the floor and the future out of mind. There's a lot that's beautiful and interesting in the Dakotas, but it's easiest to understand them when you think of the prairie as an actual ocean of grass, and the inhabited and remarkable bits like islands and reefs within that ocean. The wind blows hard, the sun shines radiantly, and it feels like there is neither a beginning or an end to the soft velvet of the tall grass as it blows back and forth on its journey from horizon to horizon. I had read about a place called Graham's Island State Park in the middle of Devil's Lake, and I was intrigued by the idea of spending a night on an actual island here in the middle of the country. I had wildly misjudged the scale of Devil's Lake. It looks big on the map, but it is goddamn massive in person. You can't even see the other shore. It's an ocean within an ocean. Graham's Island has a little road elevated from the water that you wind along to get to it. It felt as if we were on the coast again, but in truth, we had never really been farther away. The island itself was dense with trees and animals. I saw my first porcupine out there, as it waddled out of the trees, determined to raise hell with my dogs, who were certainly as startled to see it as I was. It chased us a bit as I jogged away with the leashes in hand. I had simply never been anywhere quite like it. Kinda like it, sure, but all the plants were new to me, and all the smells unfamiliar and rich. I'd come a long way to get here, and I would go a long way yet, even here towards the end. But a day into the last year of my 20s, and I was deeper into America than I'd thought I'd actually ever be able to go. The blowout with my friend from earlier in the trip still stung, and I found myself wondering if maybe he was right, and I was doing my trip wrong, that maybe I was deluding myself into thinking that I had accomplished anything by being here, that maybe I hadn't really done anything but burn gasoline and burn out everyone's patience with me. I mean, did I seriously spend close to 10 years of my life dreaming about sleeping in slightly different woods than the ones that I was used to? Have I been wasting Kendra's time and convincing her to come out here with me? There is no objective way to evaluate dreams, no easy scale to judge the morality of having achieved one. I can only say that yes, I did spend my entire adult life trying to get out and sleep underneath a different set of trees than I began with, and that it was more difficult than it sounds to do that. But Kendra didn't resent the time that she had spent on the road. She made that clear in what she'd written me for my birthday and in her demeanor. It was an adventure for her as well. It was a dream she shared back when it was still an abstract, and since we had agreed to put a cap on the nomadic experience, she had been right back in the groove of exploration. We were approaching Minnesota and the Great Lakes, where the east begins and the frontier ends. From there, each mile would be a mile back towards the beginning, a mile closer to looping the loop on the dream and drawing it to a close. The Great Lakes in the Pacific Northwest have a similar kind of vibe to them, a similar color palette, and as Kendra and I drove deeper and deeper into the public forests of northern Minnesota, the more eerily familiar everything seemed to be. It felt like driving through a long and dry shadowland to come out, ultimately, in an alternate version of the place that I left. The economic landscape had begun to fade into a new region as well. Even on the very rural byways, each town had a gas station. Businesses were open. Houses were inhabited. There was a sense of community and activity that seems to evaporate in the heat of the sun as you move into the deep west. Minnesota was a beautiful place, its forests deep and secretive, but we had arrived back in the embrace of concrete civilization by coming here. When the plains gave way to forests, I had a sense of real accomplishment that melted away much of the previous evening's anxieties and emotional boogeymen. I had taken my covered wagon and crossed the grass ocean like my ancestors had. I had roads, I had safety, but still, this 44-year-old bucket of bolts had been pitted against the wind and the dirt and the rocks of huge and exotic spaces, and it was still puttering faithfully along, and that is something I could really be proud of. I had set out to see the West, and here I was, washing up on the shore of its other side. We had been especially excited to see Voyageurs National Park, the only national park to be spread primarily across waterways. I had hoped to rent a canoe and see some of the many interconnected lakes that way, but the sky was gray and ominous. The park ranger asked, "How experienced are you two at canoeing?" and we told her it would be our first time. She laughed and said, "Well, I'm technically not allowed to advise you one way or another, but the lightning's going to start in an hour, and the wind usually comes with it." So that was that for Voyageurs. But Superior National Forest is a recreation area nearly as dense as the Black Hills, and the brilliant colors of fall still look good on an overcast day. The storm got worse and worse. The lightning and rain picked up to a severity I hadn't seen since West Texas, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows and water pouring in through the bolt holes connecting the roof to the frame. Ken and I drove down a one-lane dirt track running into the woods and found a clearing where we parked on the edge. We closed the curtains, broke out the propane heater, and discovered we had enough 4G service to stream movies. So we drank beer, and we watched Jaws as the storm reached down to rock the bus unpredictably from side to side in great gusts of wind. Sure, if I had taken this journey alone, I might have been out longer, but I'll never forget the impossible coziness of that evening and 100 like it, curled up tight with a woman I love as rain beat the thin fiberglass roof, dogs piled on top of us and snoring softly until the thunder strikes. There's a lot of joy to be had in moments of adventure, but there's equal joy in moments of comfort and connection. To combine the two is a kind of existential decadence. I feel like maybe I ought not to have been allowed to be so happy as that, but I so far seem to have gotten away with it. Our rainy day destination put into incredible relief just how good I've had it in my life. We visited the Soudan iron mine, the oldest iron mine in Minnesota and one of the best preserved for posterity. It shut down in the early 60s and has been with the park system for ever since. Visitors ride down in the industrial elevator that's been there since the 1930s, one that takes you 1.5 miles under the surface of the earth in a rattling, clanging descent at what seems like fatal speeds. Once at the bottom of the mine, you travel another mile by a passenger trolley riding along the old minecart tracks. It's an amazing underground space, in its own way as impressive as the natural caverns I've seen because of its startling depth and the seemingly permanent stability of the ancient bedrock through which it cuts. But you go down a cave to learn about geology. If you go down a mine, most of what you end up learning about is capitalism. But down here, they go hand in hand. The Soudan mine is extremely eager to remind you that it was called by its workers the Cadillac of mines, and that it was the most in-demand employer in the entire region's mining industry for a long time, many decades. None of these reasons have to do with the company running it. The stability of the rock makes cave-ins unlikely. The composition of the rock keeps the temperature stable. The many entrances keep the temperature bearable. The mine floods slowly due to how it's positioned versus the water table. In another mine, a worker might have to withstand 110-degree heat, or maybe 40-degree cold while standing in 2 feet of dirty water. Not here. Geologically speaking, it's just a very stable, dry hole in the ground, and that was enough to make it the best mine in Minnesota. The company, on the other hand, continually put the miners at risk. There are two profit models used by 19th century mining corporations. One is where the mine provides all the work tools but charges extortionate prices for food and shelter in the company town, effectively rendering the miners' labor indentured servitude. The other is where miners keep their paychecks but have to buy their own tools, including candles and dynamite. The second is a slightly more humane way to do it, because the land the workers built their houses on and the houses themselves up in the town of Tower stayed in the workers' hands if they decided to quit the mine or if they had the extreme good fortune of being able to retire. These workers were sprung from the trap of debt that other companies invited their workers to step into. And yet, the miners still spent the majority of the money they received for doing their jobs one day to pay for the equipment they needed to do their jobs the next day. And more, extensive mechanization in the mine didn't happen until the 1930s, and up until then it was mostly the work of dynamite and sledgehammers. The mine was terrified of workers unionizing, though, and so would try to make sure no group of workers spoke the same language. So there might be 10 Polish guys, 12 German guys, and 7 Chinese guys in a section, and they'd be subdivided into at least 7 groups based on that, so that nobody got any bright ideas about unionization. This is at the same time that these small groups have to coordinate swinging a sledgehammer upwards to the ceiling to drive a wedge being held by one of the other men in almost pitch darkness. So if someone screws up, someone else either gets their hand smashed or a sledgehammer dropped on their skull. The company deliberately made the coordination and communication that would prevent chronic hand smashing to better protect the profit margin and keep the miners where the company wanted them, confused and dependent. Soudan iron ore was some of the most pure of any iron mine in the country, 97% iron, without any refining process done to it. That ore found its way into the steel of almost every American car made in the first half of the 20th century. It's a rock that built our present-day world in a really concrete and tangible way. Yet, in this case, we can measure that forward progress in broken hands and feet and skulls. Can you imagine it? You're a mile under the earth, in total darkness, because you have to buy your own candles, and candles are expensive, so using them all the time is out of the question. You're surrounded by 3 nervous, sweaty men who can't understand a word any of the other guys says. One of them hands you a little metal rod, and you hold it flush with the ceiling. You hear a grunt from below you, you hear a whistle of wind, and then a sharp metal clang. If you heard a clang and not a splat, then you've gotten through another swing of the hammer. You do this 100 times a day, betting with your bones that it won't happen to you, that your hand won't be hammered with a force meant to fracture iron ore. You do this 100 times a day, for hundreds of days a row. Maybe you walk out of the mine unscathed, but every single swing of the hammer could be the end of your ability to even make a day's wage at all. You risked everything to receive almost nothing. And yet, the Soudan is still the Cadillac of mines, because despite all that, it could have easily been worse, and it usually was. The next day we continued through the rest of the Superior National Forest, the trees getting taller and denser as we wound along State Route 1 as it neared Lake Superior. When Kendra spotted the lake, the feeling of deja vu for the Pacific Northwest came in sharp and immediate. Here, rolling green forests would lead down to the rocky shore of an inland sea. It looked, pebble for pebble, like the Puget Sound. The Great Lakes are great, like the Grand Canyon is grand. It is easy to forget that those terms aren't really overselling the thing that they're attached to. The Great Lakes area is a place that I've always been curious about, but for me, this was it. This was the end of the West. The land that begins to flatten out and descend way back in western Montana was finally coming to rest in the choppy black surf of the autumn water. I'd gone 10,000 miles and more, and been on the road 8 months, and this was just barely the halfway mark of what there was to America. But as deep as I got, I didn't even see the entire West either, not by a long shot. I had barely even seen Utah, northern Nevada, northern New Mexico, East Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. I was missing much. That's how goddamn big this country is. You can spend the bulk of a year doing nothing but travel, and all your driving and all your gawking won't add up to much more than a foothill on the mountain of what's contained within the borders of the country. To say, I'm an American, is kind of a staggering generalization when you see it from this perspective of the winding byways. And yet that's the purpose of the Union, stitch together the many localities into a patchwork of shared beliefs and mutual support. That's a goal, anyway. And as I drove south from Duluth into Minneapolis, I saw that in many ways, it was working. Minneapolis is a lot like San Francisco, is a lot like Seattle, is a lot like Austin, is a lot like Denver. Although every city has its local histories, its local struggles and triumphs. The store chains are the same, you get the same greetings and thank yous inside of them, and if you fly by plane from city to city, there's no dissonance at all, no moment of cultural disconnection that might leave you disoriented. I liked Minneapolis a great deal, but it felt like putting my feet in a pair of well-worn slippers to be back in a city like it. The rhythms and the sound of an American city are the same, coast to coast. Why not? They're the spaces that we've built only for ourselves, where the landscape matters less than the people, the business, the ebb and flow of opportunity and collapse. Life in a city keeps pace with life in the culture. It changes alongside the world in your smartphone. The way we are all plugged into a decentralized digital culture works best when we're all physically centralized anyway, where things move too damn fast to let the age of the rest of the world show. Minneapolis seems like an especially pleasant city, well worn in, but vibrant. But I still could not get over that plane travel sensation of being somewhere different, but not fully feeling as if you left in the first place while I was visiting it. Leaving Minneapolis by heading as dead-on west as I could, I immediately began to feel more connected and excited. Despite their monotony, I was charmed by the plains. I loved the green and the blue. I loved the slow crawl as a green tower appears on the distant horizon and slides from the road's vanishing point towards me as if a giant beer were being served to me by an equally giant sloth. I'm sure that if I grew up with the place, I would feel differently about it, but as a coastal person, this was a wholly novel delight to me. This was the landscape of Lake Wobegon and St. Olaf, those two fictional Midwestern towns which seem to echo into every real burb you pass through. Cow country, in a way very different from cowboy country. It's the difference between pasture and true prairie land. This was, all neat and tied up with a bow, true pastoral America. Ken and I had been listening to a podcast called Stuff You Should Know, and they recommended a book that gave me a whole new view of this beautiful countryside. It's called Wisconsin Death Trip, and it's an artfully curated collection of photographs, book excerpts, and news clippings from 1890 through 1900. These bits of historical detritus paint one of the blackest, most savagely dour and melancholy pictures of American life that I have ever come across in my life. I want to share 4 brief news items that I feel especially highlight the surreal dread of that decade expressed in the book. September 8th, 1890. Mrs. Carter, residing at Trow's Mill, who has been in charge of the boarding house at A.S. Trow's Cranberry Marsh, was taken sick at the marsh last week and fell down, sustaining internal injuries which have dethroned her reason. She has been removed to her home here, and a few nights since arose from her bed and ran through the woods. A night or two after, she was found trying to strangle herself with a towel. It is hoped the trouble is only temporary, and that she may soon recover her mind. February 8th, 1891. An old Frenchman by the name of Bouillon, who lived among the hills north of this place, died February 8th. He lived a solitary and almost hermit life and came near dying alone. A man chanced to go by his house, and the hermit crawled to the door and called for aid. He was a well-educated man, and at some point studied for the ministry, but some early disappointment embittered his life. His relatives, who live in Chicago, are wealthy people, and repeatedly urged him to make his home with them, but he preferred a secluded life. He lived in squalor and in poverty, but at his death was found to be worth $10,000. December 28th, 1893. There were 2 feet of snow on the ground in Iron County, and the mercury hovered just below the 0 mark most of the time. The mines began shutting down last June, and at present there is not a single mine in operation within the Gogabec Range, a region that mined some 10 million tons of ore last year. There are, altogether, 15,000 people in a helpless condition. Strong men were found weeping because their sick wives and helpless children had nothing to eat and next to nothing to wear. Many of the single men are leaving the county, seeking a means of livelihood elsewhere, the railroads furnishing free transportation. August 17th, 1899. Christ Wald, a farmer near Poskin Lake, committed suicide by deliberately blowing his head off with dynamite. He placed a quantity of the explosive in a hole in the ground, laid his head over it, touched the fuse, and exclaimed, "Here I go, and the Lord go with me." The rolling fields of Midwestern farm country were once a place of deep madness and unexpected grim death around every corner. It is common in this book for old women to commit suicide by slitting their own throats. It is common for entire towns to be lit ablaze by arsonists. It happens several times that someone gets out of bed at night to drink wine or whiskey and dies in agony by drinking an unlabeled bottle of carbonic acid stored next to the booze instead. This is the heartland, the world of St. Olaf and Lake Wobegon, but it's also the world of Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. Some people see that painting as being complementary to the frontier spirit, but I certainly don't. Look at those two, with their shuttered home and heavy expressions. These are weird people with deep anxieties, out here with nobody but the cows and a growing sense of existential terror, as the wind and the sun and the years blow the paint from their home and the youth from their faces. Europeans may have invented the Gothic aesthetic, but I think it's we Americans who may end up mastering it. The Sioux, as always, have a different way of looking at the end of all things and of collapse. Their story goes that out here in the broken hills of the South Dakota Badlands, there's a cave. Inside the cave is an old woman and her dog. The woman's got a giant heap of pine needles, and she's weaving them into a rug. She weaves the rug all day and most of the night, but still has to take breaks to sleep and to eat. Whenever her attention is diverted, her dog will seize the rug and shake it, throwing pine needles all over the room and setting back her work by a good margin. Bad dog, right? Well, if the woman ever finishes her rug, time will end. The world will stop, as easy as if you had turned off the television in the middle of the program. It's understood that this is not malicious. It's simply the arrangement between the woman, the dog, and the universe. The universe will wait for her rug to be done before ending. It'll give her that, but no more. So we all have this willful hound that does its owner such distress to thank for our continued existence. I especially enjoy that story as a story of apocalypse because it's so quiet and warm. We don't always know that our efforts will have a dire consequence. We don't always understand that our inconveniences can save us from ourselves. And that back and forth between what we want and what we get can go on into indefinite eternity without resolution. South Dakota is a good landscape for myth, and that's a better myth than most. The Badlands here are the result of many millions of years of sedimentary deposits being eaten away by just a few 100,000 years of flowing water. The result is a jagged wall of multicolored sand dividing one side of the dry prairie from the other. It actually does resemble an ocean reef, although very little of it is organic, and the oceans packed up and moved away hundreds of millions of years ago. The Badlands at Theodore Roosevelt National Park felt like a cohesive landscape, as jumbled as it can become. The heavily eroded oddity of its ornery hills faded and blended deeper into itself and then out into the plains with a kind of grace. These ones, the South Dakota ones of Badlands National Park, feel much more raw and wounded, as if there was a much larger mountain here once before, and it was ripped off of the plains, leaving a searing absence of itself behind. There's no geologic truth to that, but there's no artistic sense to this place at all either, and the mind still tries to resolve that lack of visual sense and that vacuum of understanding. They're especially strange when they sit small and low on the boulders. It feels surreal out here, but it is as real as it gets. It's the work only of time, wind, and water. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic. But doesn't it feel like both those things anyway? This is just a day's drive away from the green pastures of Minnesota, but as you enter South Dakota again, headed west, the color soon fades from the grass and the air becomes sharper and windier. Then, in the distance, these things appear like a worn-down jawbone looming huge on the horizon. The scenic loop goes up and down the walls of the Badlands and the valleys of the Badlands over and over again, providing some impossible and memorable views in spectacular variety. Regardless of how Edward Abbey would feel about it, I was personally excited to have the opportunity to drive my bus all the way to the moon at last. After leaving Badlands, we crossed the Black Hills one more time, still headed due west, which led us into the Thunder Basin National Grassland. It's this part of the country, just on the far western side of the basin, where I encountered the community center that I started off this whole rambling and godforsaken story with. I've looped myself twice now doing so, looping my trip through the Odas, which began and ended with the Black Hills, and looping my story as I'm telling it. The only thing left to loop is my whole damn trip by arriving back in Seattle. But you can't drive 2,000 miles through the West without seeing some amazing things, even if you're no longer cutting a serpentine route to find them. I'd imagine going across Wyoming would be just the same as going across the plains of the Dakotas, but It wasn't. There is something about Wyoming that's unique and compelling even among other Midwestern states. It has a kind of edge and a kind of mystery to it that Colorado and Montana don't especially have. Wyoming is often regarded as something special by Western literature, too, appearing as a common fixation of novelists, painters, and other artists, and not just the roaming cowhands and handymen and miners who are most evident on the streets of its aging towns. The variety of landscape certainly has something to do with it. Wyoming is home to the settings of both Yogi Bear and Starship Troopers. The former takes place in Yellowstone National Park, the absolute most famous and most trafficked of all the national parks, and the latter illustrated the planet of Klendathu by filming it in a Badlands formation about halfway across southern Wyoming called Hell's Half Acre. Today, Hell's Half Acre is permanently closed due to an especially severe recurring rattlesnake infestation. No joke. Too many snakes to keep it open and not get sued, so it gets fenced off and shut down. But the point is, it takes only half a day to drive from one planet to another out here as far as pop culture imagery is concerned. Out of all the states I want to come back to and see in greater detail, Wyoming places first. A lot of that is having missed some of the parts I was most excited about seeing due to the advancing season. As I drove westward, the weather got worse and worse as I climbed the mountains toward Shoshone National Forest, and I saw the white blanket of snow further up and found that I was just days late for the first major snow of the season. I'd wanted to explore Shoshone because it was the setting of an adventure game called Firewatch, one of the only games I've ever played that really engages with the American landscape in the literary way that I've been used to from the authors who inspired me to do this trip. It's a game very concerned with the form and meaning of Wyoming. But it's also a game that takes place at the height of summer, and everything here was buried under several feet of snow with several more coming down around me. I was foiled again. There would be no navigating the dirt paths of Shoshone with all of this shit going on. I think, over the course of the whole trip, I got to see somewhere between half and two-thirds of the things that I had planned to see. Most of those things that I missed, I was disqualified for because of the dogs, but the other things were pretty much all weather-related. However, more than triple the number of things I had missed were things that I never knew to look for in the first place, and ended up liking just as much. The snows weren't one of those things, though. The snows were a problem. The snow would have us skipping Grand Teton National Park, because the entire point of that park is walking up mountains, and it was cold enough outside the bus to freeze what tears the wind would coax from your tear ducts. Another time, I hope. But Yellowstone National Park sits immediately atop Grand Teton, with just a tiny sliver of public land between them. Yellowstone, I imagined, would have its roads plowed. Yellowstone is the first ever national park in both the United States and the world at large. It's one of the biggest in the entire park system, sitting primarily in Wyoming, but extending also into Idaho and Montana. And of course, the key detail, it is the only national park to feature an active supervolcano. Not just the regular sort, the super kind. National Geographic explains it this way, quote, "Ordinary volcanoes generally occur along the edges of tectonic plates. Supervolcanoes blaze directly through those plates, like a stationary torch burning blisters through a sliding sheet of steel. And the Yellowstone torch, feeding heat towards preposterous eruptions, is likely the largest beneath any continent on Earth." It's already erupted spectacularly, too. All of the major recreation and geyser areas are within the Caldera Depression blown out during the most recent explosion. Visitors get to stroll across an actual volcanic hotspot without having to deal with real lava like the volcanic parks in Hawaii. Here, all the action is in the water. Heat and pressure move from geyser pool to geyser pool through underground channels that connect most of the pools into a network. The volcanic activity roiling deep under the surface heats a pool, lets the pressure build, and then heats something different when the geyser goes off and the pressure is released. What happens in one pool affects the others, in a chain. Meanwhile, the incredible spectrum of colors in the pools is the result not of unusual mineral deposition, but heat-loving microbes who have found their perfect niche environment within the pools and bloomed into these layered, multicolor colonies. Across the West, we had seen the leftover work of volcanoes and how they shaped and reshaped the landscape, but here's the only place where you can go and see it happening fresh. The huge size of the park and the fact that the caldera and the geysers are clustered in the southwest portion has meant that big chunks of Yellowstone are deeply wild, only trafficked by the woodsiest of hikers and the most adventurous of birdwatchers. The snows when we saw them, though, were ubiquitous, and the bus had already begun balding its tires over the past 11,000 miles. We were at the mercy of the plows, and the plows care most about the Old Faithful Loop. Not like that was any kind of disappointment, though. There's nothing I've ever seen the West over as intoxicatingly strange as the Yellowstone geyser pools. They're just so far outside the range of even regular natural expression, from the blooms to the smell of aerosol sulfur to the sound of ominous gurgling and boiling from all corners of the hills. It's a rare and unique thing. Less powerful, we would not notice these volcanic forces. More powerful, they would probably kill us. There's a very, very delicate in-between space where the heat is just enough to transform the surface and not cook it off entirely. That's here. That's Yellowstone. Ulysses S. Grant declared this as the first national park in 1872, and while we're all grateful that he sobered up enough to sign it into law, it really was not until Theodore Roosevelt's vision of the parks came to be that this place was fully protected from development. It was not the environmentalists like Muir, but the railroad lackeys who first surveyed the area. They took in the supernatural beauty of this supervolcano and thought to themselves, you know, folks would pay a lot of dollar bills to see something so rare and unique. That's both the appeal and the frustration of Yellowstone National Park. It is the #1 natural tourist destination of the U.S., beating out the Grand Canyon in attendance. It is genuinely a crowning jewel of natural splendor on the American continent. It has its own Grand Canyon, not as big as Arizona's, but with an incredible waterfall. It has wildlife to spare. The buffalo here are so completely used to people by now that they wander along the most populated boardwalks. But deeper are bears, buzzards, a functional and whole ecosystem preserved within the many square miles of public land. You can find the echoes of a dozen other national parks within this single one. It is more than the Black Hills, more than Superior National Forest, more than the Grand Canyon, the densest concentration of wild beauty on the American continent. You could spend months here and not exhaust it. And while the density and complexity of nature means that you could say the same thing about, like, Guadalupe Mountains National Park, which certainly has months of things to see by volume, I'm also factoring in a modern attention span. You could be one jaded, jittery motherfucker and still be moved by Yellowstone even after having hit all the highlights. But the densest parts of the park, and the caldera, are so overwhelmingly crowded that it does feel like going to a theme park and not to nature. You'll wait in lines. You'll be jostled by folks who give you the old stink eye for having the audacity to breathe the same air as they do. You'll hear somewhere between a half dozen and 24 middle-aged couples getting into loud fights, some of them apparently not having spent time in the same room together for decades before piling into the Escalade and driving for 2 days to get there. Nature is grand. Sometimes people are too, but people are also small, vindictive, and petty. And there's just no getting away from it when you cram so many together alongside their expectation to be entertained. I honestly don't know how rangers can be so patient with tourists who ask them, no joke, to bump up the times of the geyser eruptions to something more convenient for them. People come here thinking of it as a theme park more often than not, it seems, and behave accordingly. All around, you'll see people treating this natural space as if it was a curated ride at Disneyland. Tour buses come out and spit out 50 to 100 retirees at a time, sometimes from Cleveland, sometimes from China, but always in a clanking flood of canes and cameras and cackling laughter. I was driving our own bus at the speed limit in the park, but I'm pretty certain that I gave a woman driving a Porsche SUV an actual ulcer by refusing to go past 35 despite her willingness to honk at me about it for 5 miles straight. The stereotype of ugly American usually refers to folks in the U.S. who, when abroad, will be as demanding as humanly possible and then complain at length when things are even the slightest bit uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Well, you don't actually have to leave the country to witness the effect. You just have to get these people to leave the house at all and then go where they go. Seeing Yellowstone is one of those things you're supposed to do if you've got a family or an expensive pickup truck. So people do it, even if they don't really care a lot about Yellowstone to begin with, and don't really understand what they're seeing when they're here. It's fudgy culture, deep as you get with it. But I meant it when I said that Yellowstone National Park was intoxicatingly, mesmerizingly beautiful country. It's inspiring without even trying to be. Suburban narcissism is a hell of a drug, but if Yellowstone can't break its hold, I really don't imagine that anything else will. West of Yellowstone, the road winds down the mountain to the high desert of southern Idaho. The landscape flattens out, and there's a dramatic moment headed that direction where the green and forested mountain foothills altogether disappear into the flat lowland within a single mile, as if a rolling pin was drawn across everything from that point out. What's funny here is that the road more or less follows the path cut by the Yellowstone hotspot on its slow tectonic journey eastward. Like National Geographic described it, the hotspot is like a torch burning upwards into a sheet of metal being slowly pulled across the flame. Well, 10 to 12 million years ago, it was an area about 200 miles west of Yellowstone and 200 miles east of present-day Boise where the hotspot was blazing. As the hotspot effectively migrated to the northeast, volcanic activity out here in the Idaho desert remained strong. This created the blackened and hostile landscape of Craters of the Moon National Monument. The last eruption was recent, just a little over 2,000 years ago. Another one is likely coming in the next 900 years. But the monument is miles from anywhere except nearby Arco and the nearly abandoned Atomic City. It's a presence you feel coming from quite a distance away. Slowly the browns and golds of the grasses start becoming dappled with black. Just a few spots at first, with nothing on the horizon. Then more and more until the grass becomes accessory to the chunky volcanic rubble. Here, the cinder cones of the expired volcanoes start to come into view. Once you go deeper into the monument itself, you're just driving over pure lava rock. It's a truly post-apocalyptic landscape here. Once, this was all fire. Now it's cooled into these cones and piles, so dense with igneous material that plants still have not reclaimed much of the core wasteland. Not really what you picture when you think Idaho, is it? Think back on Four Corners. We call this Idaho, but what it physically is as a landscape doesn't really much matter to how it's labeled and abstractly imagined. Southern Idaho and northern Nevada are part of a continuous ripple of landscape. North of here, the towering mountains of the Sawtooth Range begin, and if you keep going into Montana, you'll eventually reach Glacier National Park that way as well. There's potato farms and forests and all the things on Idaho postcards nearby, a matter of several hours' drive away. But out here is a kind of singularly, charismatically bleak landscape that slipped through the cracks of the state's self-identity. Why? I've been to the Panhandle, and the Panhandle is lovely, but it's not like it is out here. 8 years ago, I had come to Craters of the Moon in a 1973 Mercury Marquis with my friend Jed, and we had arrived maybe an hour too late after the sunset to see anything. This day, I had been pushing the bus as fast as it was willing to try and go to make it in time, and the sunset was already on me when I was 10 miles away from Craters of the Moon. But sunsets out here linger, and there was enough time to get to the Inferno Cone in the center of the monument before the light died out entirely. I climbed this with my puppy behind me, and at the top I got the greatest panorama of my whole journey. The GoPro footage here does not accurately capture the colors. They were deeper in person, richer. The light was as orange as I've ever seen it, and distant thunderstorms laid delicate veils of black lacy rain over the distant desert. The sun illuminated the faraway peaks and cast the plains into shadow. It was a kind of layered, folding landscape that had made me fall in love with the Southwest years ago when my dad took me camping as a child. It was the edge of the mountains, the edge of the desert, the edge of the plains, all things meeting together at this long-exhausted bonfire of rock. I had been so disappointed to miss it 8 years ago, and it took me all those 8 years to get back and see it for real. And I had made it by, 45 minutes to spare over my previous time? To be here, at this moment, in this eternal Idaho sunset, this is what I wanted. This is what I wanted out of the whole experience. This is what I came out here to find. I couldn't explain it to the puppy, and I couldn't explain it much to myself, but she wagged her tail and seemed to be happy for me all the same. On that other road trip back towards the beginning of my adult life, I had pulled an all-nighter and driven across all of Nevada in a bid to reach San Diego the next day, and I figured that tradition was tradition, and I would drive all night this evening too. Earlier, when we were at Yellowstone, it was the coldest night that Kendra and I had ever had in the bus. We were almost out of propane when the sun went down, and a couple of hours later the space heater began to let out a high-pitched squeal. The comforting neon orange of the heating surface faded to a more subdued sunset color, then to red. Then the squeal faded out, and the heater became as dark as the night outside. Kendra turns to me, puts a hand on my cheek, and says, "Sweetheart, take me home." We had a laugh about that, but the morning snow was so severe that Kendra ended up using a trick that she learned from the Walking Dead TV show of wrapping sticks in a t-shirt and wedging them under tires for traction. It worked perfectly, but it underlined the point. The season was run through. Everywhere that I wanted to go now above 4,000 feet was snowed over. So I figured that was it. I would drive us through the lower mountains of eastern Oregon and along the Columbia River to the I-5, which we had broken off to follow the 101 out of Olympia 9 months and 12,000 miles previous. That night, I surprised myself by making it 100 miles into Oregon. I passed through Boise at 1 in the morning, one of the few vehicles on the spacious 8-lane freeway. It's strange to see most desert cities because they're always so spread out and weather-beaten, but Boise at night had a particular rough and tumble vibe to it, and its 20 miles of neon that really stuck with me. I had always conceived of the West as being the Southwest. That misconception meant that I could have come here a lot earlier in my life and found what I was looking for. But I didn't. I was now within 1,000 miles of the Puget Sound. That was all it took to find the frontier, to find the West. But I didn't know, or didn't realize, or didn't open my eyes to it until then. I was instantly glad that I had chosen the early AM hours to make the drive. The night wind kept the engine cool, and the emptiness of the freeway meant that I could go 35 or 40 miles an hour in third gear up the mountain passes without too many truckers having to deal with me. The bus was getting a little tired and wheezy altogether, but it had been faithful, beyond my wildest dreams and expectations, and I was grateful for its service. If the bus wanted to go 35 in the 70 zone, then god damn it, I was going to let it go 35. So, I'm glad for 3 in the morning, and glad of what 3 in the morning means for making that possible. Just past Rio Grande, I reached the public forests and the summit of the pass. I pulled off to the side of the road, slept deeply, and woke up for the last day of my trip under the gray clouds and green pine needles that told me that I had finally come back around again to the place that I had left. The last day would be a long one, and although the time for sightseeing detours had passed, there was absolutely no way in hell I was going to go back to Seattle without having visited Stonehenge. It was easy, though. Stonehenge is right on the way back home. If you travel along the path of the Columbia River, you can bypass the Cascade Mountains entirely, moving along the cliff face as the river carves its wide gorge across lowlands below the mountain range. Oregon is on one side with a freeway, Washington the other side with a scenic byway. Follow the byway halfway down the gorge and you'll reach Maryhill. Here you'll find a full-scale, astronomically aligned replica of Stonehenge. It's actually a kind of middle finger to modern European conflict by a man named Sam Hyde. It was begun in Hyde in 1918 when World War I was still ongoing. It was a popular theory at the time that the Druids practiced human sacrifice at the original Stonehenge, so Hyde erected this monument to the soldiers of Klickitat County who had perished already in the war, and those that might perish in the future. The plaque reads, quote, "This monument is erected in the hope that others inspired by the example of their valor and their heroism may share in that love of liberty and burn with that fire of patriotism which death alone can quench." It's pretty heavy duty. The plaque is on the altar, which, if you're following Hyde's symbolism, is the altar where those American boys are being sacrificed to the old world's wars. So what you're looking at here is layered. This is an American version of Stonehenge, so it improves on the English version by restoring its lost chunks. It's got to be bigger and better than the original, or it's not really American, is it? But it misinterprets and sensationalizes the original ruin by grounding itself in the disproven idea of human sacrifice at Stonehenge. It then takes that initial misunderstanding and uses it to broadly criticize American military support of the country from which this entire symbolic work is based. It's just absolutely bizarre, from conception to execution to the inevitable decline of context when time moves on and it becomes just as old as the actual Stonehenge. Maybe it'll inspire its own tales of cannibalism in some confused future. It's confusing enough as it is. Maryhill is remote even within the Northwest. It's hours from the freeway, and I was only convenient to it because I was already heading west out of the rolling farmland that goes on for hundreds of miles back the direction I came from. You have to drive past all the main recreation areas of the Columbia River area to reach Maryhill. But Stonehenge still draws quite a crowd because it feels right to have something so wholly weird and symbolically dense sitting out here in a scenically gorgeous no-man's land on the way between nothing and nowhere. To find these little oases of human imagination in the middle of ancient nature is half the fun of road tripping, and the other half is losing your sense of self in the face of that ancient nature. Places like this are fun, they're absurdist, but they're also a little existentially disorienting, and that is their deepest pleasure. To stand inside something that ought not to be there at all, and be mocked by it being there anyway, chips away at certainty, chips away at expectation, and gives that authority back to the human imagination. This was our last stop, not counting gas stations. The drive down the Columbia from there was especially beautiful, greener and greener as the mountain range came and went out the right window of the bus. Kendra got her old job back within 24 hours of getting back into Seattle, and was right back at her old position 2 days after that. I got my weekly catering gig back myself, and then I was catatonically miserable for over a month. It was, functionally, as if we had never left at all. My bus was parked where it had been parked last summer before the roof was even affixed to it. I was playing my games in my father-in-law's garage like I had been 2 years previously. It was as if I had taped over a portion of the VHS of my life with a different program called Noah's Wilderness Adventure, and now it was over, and I'm an hour or so deeper into the movie that was originally playing on the tape. My worry in North Dakota blossomed into full-on panic when I realized that I genuinely had not even considered in any kind of realistic terms what would happen if the trip ended, and then things just kinda kept going. I had seen through the end of my dream and the end of my vision, and I'm not sure if I had expected to simply disappear as some giant unseen hand closes a book and says, I liked Bill Bryson better. I hadn't tracked that whether you give up on a dream or succeed in a dream, you're still bereft of a dream in the hazy afterwards. I went through fits of some of the most severe self-doubt I've ever had in my life. What if, having gotten everything that I ever wanted, it turned out that what I wanted was just pure, unadulterated bullshit, and so was I? My old routine had come back with such a hurricane force that everything I had done on the road suddenly felt very intangible. I felt absolutely stuck. I had accomplished myself, and what of it? What had changed? I spent most of a couple weeks sleeping. I had been avoiding finishing the Dark Tower books because I knew I hated the ending. When I was a teenager, I got so angry at King's last chapter and his decision to make the ending cyclical that I didn't read anything by him again until this trip when Kendra and I went on a frenzy of his work, picking up paperbacks in antique malls across the Southwest. I figured I might as well try, though, because it couldn't make me feel any worse than I was already feeling. Here's what I realized this time around, though. The ending of the Dark Tower was never going to be the ending that I wanted it to be. In The Gunslinger, the first book of the series, it's made clear that the top of the Dark Tower contains the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Working slowly over decades, King didn't really have to address that, until one day he got to the end of his story and must have realized, shit, here we are at the top of the tower, and I don't actually know the answer to life, the universe, and everything. I often wonder why King wrote himself into the story, because it is so strange and dissonant a choice, but I think maybe it's this anxiety over having promised too much at the very beginning, and finding that the time for collections was approaching whether he wanted it to or not. To make a character of himself absolves him of authorial omnipotence, demonstrates to the reader that he is also on this journey, and is not sure where it'll end up or how it'll turn out. If Stephen King is just a man, then he doesn't have to know all the answers. So, he sidesteps a concrete resolution in the Dark Tower story. Roland reaches the top of the tower, after each level having shown him a scene of his life, his long ages of choices, and then he walks out onto the white and rocky desert soil of the first scene of the first book. His journey could have no resolution because the journey was what he was. When Roland is over, he will begin again. There's a tragic element to this because Roland never remembers his uncounted and perhaps infinite successes, always hard-won, always painful. The end is the beginning is the end. But in the book, Roland also gets to keep something that he had previously left behind, a horn. Myself, I was exactly where I had started in January, but I had nevertheless gone 12,500 miles in a 44-year-old box made of aluminum and wood and powered by a lawnmower. And I had not gone back to where I was or who I was years ago when I first kindled the dream, or even when I first bought the bus. I had a wife who I loved, and who was happy to be back at the helm of her own navigations through the world. I had fine dogs. I had extensive and wonderful family. I was better than I used to be. Things were better. I didn't have to go back to the very beginning of myself, even if I had finished the story that I had started way back then. The traveling season is over, but the snows thaw every spring, and then I'll have my turn again to go headlong into the desert wind and to begin.